Chapter 13 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 13. McKay still had his mind on a certain stretch of timber that reached out into the barren lands, hundreds of miles farther north. In this hiding place, 3 years before, he had built himself a cabin, and had caught foxes during half the long winter. Not only the cabin, but the foxes, were drawing him. Necessity was close upon his heels. What little money he possessed after leaving Cragg's Ridge was exhausted, his supplies were gone, and his boots and clothes were patched with deer hide. In the Snowbird Lake country, a week after he left Cassidy in his paradise at Wollaston, he fell in with good fortune. 2 trappers had come in from Churchill. One of them was sick, and the other needed help in the building of their winter cabin. McKay remained with them for 10 days, and when he continued his journey northward, his pack was stuffed with supplies, and he wore new boots and more comfortable clothes. It was the middle of October when he found his old cabin, 1,000 miles from Cragg's Ridge. It was as he had left it 3 years ago. No one had opened its door since then. The little box stove was waiting for a fire. Behind it was a pile of wood. On the table were the old tin dishes, and hanging from babiche cords fastened to the roof timbers, out of reach of mice and ermine, were blankets and clothing and other possessions he had left behind him in that winter break-up of what seemed like ages ago to him. He raised a small section in the floor, and there were his traps, thickly coated with caribou grease. For half an hour before he built a fire, he sought eagerly for the things he had concealed here and there. He found oil and a tin lamp and candles, and as darkness of the first night gathered outside, a roaring fire sent sparks up the chimney, and the little cabin's one window glowed with light, and the battered old coffee-pot bubbled and steamed again, as if rejoicing at his return. With the breaking of another day, he immediately began preparations for the season's trapping. In 2 days' hunting he killed 3 caribou, his winter meat. Then he cut wood and made his strychnine poison baits, and marked out his trap lines. The 1st of November brought the chill whisperings of an early winter through the Northland. Farther south autumn was dying, or dead. The last of the red ash-berries hung shriveled and frostbitten on naked twigs. Freezing nights were nipping the face of the earth, the voices of the wilderness were filled with a new note, and the winds held warning for every man and beast between Hudson's Bay and the Great Slave, and from the height of land to the Arctic Sea. 7 years before there had come such a winter, and the land had not forgotten it. A winter sudden and swift, deadly in its unexpectedness, terrific in its cold, bringing with it such famine and death as the Northland had not known for 2 generations. But this year there was premonition. Omen of it came with the first wailing night winds that bore the smell of icebergs from over the black forests north and west. The moon came up red, and it went down red, and the sun came up red in the morning. The loon's call died a month ahead of its time. The wild geese drove steadily south, when they should have been feeding from the Kogatuk to Baffin's Bay, and the beaver built his walls thick, and anchored his alders and his willows deep, so that he would not starve when the ice grew heavy. East, west, north, and south, in forest and swamp, in the trapper's cabin and the wolf's hiding place, was warning of it. Gray rabbits turned white. Moose and caribou began to herd. The foxes yipped shrilly in the night, and a new hunger and a new thrill sent the wolves hunting in packs, while the gray geese streaked southward under the red moon overhead. Through this November and all of December, Jolly Roger and Peter were busy from 2 hours before dawn of each day until late at night. The foxes were plentiful, and McKay was compelled to shorten his lines and put out fewer baits, and on the 10th of December he set out for a fur trading post 90 miles south with 240 skins. He had made a toboggan and a harness for Peter, and pulling together they made the trip in 3 days, and on the 4th started for the cabin again with supplies and something over $1,000 in cash. Through the weeks of increasing storm and cold that followed, McKay continued to trap, and early in February he made another trip to the fur post. It was on their return that they were caught in the black storm. It will be a long time before the Northland will forget that storm. It was a storm in which the Sarcees died to a man, woman, and child over on the Dubawnt waterways, and when trees froze solid and split open with the sharp explosions of high-powered guns. In it, all furred and feathered life and all hoof and horn along the edge of the Barren Lands from Aberdeen Lake to the Coppermine was swallowed up. It was in this storm that streams froze solid, and the man who was cautious fashioned a babiche rope about his waist when he went forth from his cabin for food or water, so that his wife might help to pull and guide him back through that blinding avalanche of wind and freezing fury that held a twisted and broken world in its grip. In the country west of Artillery Lake and south of the Theolon River, Jolly Roger and Peter were compelled to dig in. They were in a country where the biggest stick of wood that thrust itself up out of the snow was no bigger than McKay's thumb, a country of green grass and succulent moss on which the caribou fed in season, but a hell on earth when Arctic storm howled and screamed across it in winter. Piled up against a mass of rock, Jolly Roger found a huge snowdrift. This drift was as long as a church and half as high, with its outer shell blistered and battered to the hardness of rock by wind and sleet. Through this shell he cut a small door with his knife, and after that dug out the soft snow from within, until he had a room half as big as his cabin, and so snug and warm after a little with the body heat of himself and Peter that he could throw off the thick coat which he wore. To Peter, in the first night of this storm, it seemed as though all the people in the world were shrieking and wailing and sobbing in the blackness outside. Jolly Roger sat smoking his pipe at intervals in the gloom, though there was little pleasure in smoking a pipe in darkness. The storm did not oppress him, but filled him with an odd sense of security and comfort. The wind shrieked and lashed itself about his snow dune, but it could not get at him. Its mightiest efforts to destroy only beat more snow upon him and made him safer and warmer. In a way, there was something of humor as well as tragedy in this wild frenzy, and Peter heard him laugh softly in the darkness. More and more frequently he had heard that laugh since those warm days of autumn when they had last met the red-headed man, Terence Cassidy, of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and his master had shot him on the white shore of Wollaston. "You see," said McKay, caressing Peter's hairy neck in the gloom, "everything is turning out right for us, and I'm beginning to believe more and more what Yellow Bird told us, and that in the end we're going to be happy, somewhere, with Nada. What do you think, Pied-Bot? Shall we take a chance and go back to Cragg's Ridge in the spring?" Peter wriggled himself in answer, as a wild shriek of wind wailed over the huge snow dune. Jolly Roger's fingers tightened at Peter's neck. "Well, we're going," he said, as though he were telling Peter something new. "I'm believing Yellow Bird, Pied-Bot. I'm believing her, now. What she told us was more than fortune-telling. It wasn't just Indian sorcery. When she shut herself up and starved for those 3 days and nights in her little conjurer's house, just for you and me, something happened. Didn't it? Wouldn't you say something happened?" Peter swallowed, and his teeth clicked as he gave evidence of understanding. "She told us a lot of truth," went on Jolly Roger, with deep faith in his voice. "And we must believe, Pied-Bot. She told us Cassidy was coming after us, and he came. She said the spirits promised her the law would never get us, and we thought it looked bad when Cassidy had us covered with his gun on the shore at Wollaston. But something more than luck was with us, and we shot him. Then we brought him back to life, and lugged him to a cabin, and the little stranger girl took him and nursed him, and Cassidy fell in love with her and married her. So Yellow Bird was right again, Pied-Bot. We've got to believe her. And she says everything is coming out right for us, and that we are going back to Nada, and be happy." Jolly Roger's pipe bowl glowed in the blackness. "I'm going to light the alcohol lamp," he said. "We can't sleep, and I want a good smoke. It isn't fun when you can't see the smoke. Too bad God forgot to make you so you could use a pipe, Peter. You don't know what you're missing, in times like these." He fumbled in his pack and found the alcohol lamp, which was fresh filled and screwed tight. Peter heard him working for a moment in the darkness. Then he struck a match, and the yellow flare of it lighted up his face. In his joy, Peter whined. It was good to see his master. And then, in another moment, the little lamp was filling their white-walled refuge with a mellow glow. Jolly Roger's eyes, coming suddenly out of darkness, were wide and staring. His face was covered with a scrub beard. But there was something of cheer about him even in this night of terror outside, and when he had driven his snowshoe into the snow wall, and had placed the lamp on it, he grinned companionably at Peter. Then, with a deep breath of satisfaction, he puffed out clouds of smoke from his pipe, and stood up to look about their room. "Not so bad, is it?" he asked. "We could have a big house here if we wanted to dig out rooms, eh, Peter? Parlors and bedrooms and a library, and not a policeman within 1,000,000 miles of us. That's the nice part of it, Pied-Bot, none of the Royal Mounties to trouble us. They would never think of looking for us in the heart of a big snow dune out in this God-forsaken barren, would they?" The thought was a pleasing one to Jolly Roger. He spread out his blankets on the snow floor and sat down on them, facing Peter. "We've got 'em beat," he said, a chuckling note of pride in his voice. "The world is small when it comes to hiding, Pied-Bot, but all the people in it couldn't find us here, not in 1,000,000 years. If we could only find a place as safe as this, where a girl could live, and had Nada with us—" Many times during the past few weeks Peter had seen the light that flamed up now in his master's eyes. That, and the strange thrill in Jolly Roger's voice, stirred him more than the words to which he listened, and tried to understand. "And we're going to," finished McKay, almost fiercely, his hands clenching as he leaned toward Peter. "We have made a big mistake, Pied-Bot, and it has taken us a long time to see it. It'll be hard for us to leave our north country, but that is what we must do. Maybe Yellow Bird's good spirits meant that when they said we would find happiness with Nada in a place called the Country Beyond. There are a lot of countries beyond, Peter, and as soon as the spring break-up comes and we can travel without leaving trails behind us, we will go back to Cragg's Ridge and get Nada, and hit for some place where the law won't expect to find us. There's China, for instance. A lot of yellow people. But what do we care for color as long as we have her with us? I say—" Suddenly he stopped, and Peter's body grew tense. Both faced the round hole, half filled with softly packed snow, which McKay had cut as a door into the heart of the big drift. They had grown accustomed to the tumult of the storm, its strange wailings and the shrieking voices which at times seemed born in the moaning sweep of it no longer sent shivers of apprehension through Peter. But in that moment when both turned to listen, there came a sound which was not like the other sounds they had heard. It was a voice, not one of the phantom voices of the screaming wind, but a voice so real and so near that for a beat or two even Jolly Roger McKay's heart stood still. It was as if a man, standing just beyond their snow barricade, had shouted a name. But there came no second call. The wind lulled so that for a space there was stillness outside. Jolly Roger laughed a little uneasily. "Good thing we don't believe in ghosts, Peter, or we would swear it was a loup-garou smelling us through the wall." He thumbed the tobacco down in his pipe and nodded. "Then there is South America," he said. "They have everything down there, the biggest rivers in the world, the biggest mountains, and so much room that even a loup-garou couldn't hunt us out. She will love it, Pied-Bot. But if it happens she likes Africa better, or Australia, or the South Sea— Now what the devil was that?" Peter had jumped as if stung, and for a moment Jolly Roger sat tense as a carven Indian. Then he rose to his feet, a look of perplexity and doubt in his eyes. "What was it, Peter? Can the wind shoot a gun like that?" Peter was sniffing at the loosely blocked door of their snow room. A whimper rose in his throat. He looked up at Jolly Roger, his eyes glowing fiercely through the mass of Airedale whiskers that covered his face. He wanted to dig. He wanted to plunge out into the howling darkness. Slowly McKay beat the ash out of his pipe and placed the pipe in his pocket. "We'll take a look," he said, something repressive in his voice. "But it isn't reasonable, Peter. It is the wind. There couldn't be a man out there, and it wasn't a rifle we heard. It is the wind, with the devil himself behind it." With a few sweeps of his hand and arms he scooped out the loose snow from the hole. The opening was on the sheltered side of the drift, and only the whirling eddies of the storm swept about him as he thrust out his head and shoulders. But over him it was rushing like an avalanche. He could hear nothing but the moaning advance of it. And he could see nothing. He held out his hand before his face, and blackness swallowed it. "We have been chased so much that we're what you might call supersensitive," he said, pulling himself back, and nodding at Peter in the gray light of the alcohol lamp. "Guess we'd better turn in, boy. This is a good place to sleep. Plenty of fresh air, no mosquitoes or black flies, and the police so far away that we will soon forget how they look. If you say so, we will have a nip of cold tea and a bite—" He did not finish. For a moment the wind had lessened in fury, as if gathering a deeper breath. And what he heard drew a cry from him this time, and a sharper whine from Peter. Out of the blackness of the night had come a woman's voice. In that first instant of shock and amazement he would have staked his life that what he heard was not a mad outcry of the night or an illusion of his brain. It was clear, distinct, a woman's voice coming from out of the barren, rising above the storm in an agony of appeal, and dying out quickly until it became a part of the moaning wind. And then, with equal force, came the absurdity of it to McKay. A woman! He swallowed the lump that had risen in his throat, and tried to laugh. A woman, out in that storm, 1,000 miles from nowhere. It was inconceivable. The laugh which he forced from his lips was husky and unreal, and there was a smothering grip of something at his heart. In the ghostly light of the alcohol lamp his eyes were wide open and staring. He looked at Peter. The dog stood stiff-legged before the hole. His body was trembling. "Peter!" With a responsive wag of his tail, Peter turned his bristling face up to his master. Many times Jolly Roger had seen that unfailing warning in his comrade's eyes. There was someone outside. Or Peter's brain, like his own, was twisted and fooled by the storm. Against his reasoning, in the face of the absurdity of it, Jolly Roger was urged into action. He changed the snowshoe and replaced the alcohol lamp so that the glow of light could be seen more clearly from the barren. Then he went to the hole and crawled through. Peter followed him. As if infuriated by their audacity, the storm lashed itself over the top of the dune. They could hear the hissing whine of fine hard snow tearing above their heads like volleys of shot, and the force of the wind reached them even in their shelter, bringing with it the flinty sting of the snow dust. Beyond them the black barren was filled with a dismal moaning. Looking up, and yet seeing nothing in the darkness, Peter understood where the weird shriekings and ghostly cries came from. It was the wind whipping itself up the side and over the top of the dune. Jolly Roger listened, hearing only the convulsive sweep of that mighty force over 1,000 miles of barren. And then came again one of those brief intervals when the storm seemed to rest for a moment, and its moaning grew less and less until it was like the sound of giant chariot wheels receding swiftly over the face of the earth. Then came the silence, a few seconds of it, while in the north gathered swiftly the whispering rumble of a still greater force. And in this silence came once more a cry which Jolly Roger McKay could no longer disbelieve, and close upon the cry the report of a rifle. Again he could have sworn the voice was a woman's voice. As nearly as he could judge, it came from dead ahead, out of the chaos of blackness, and in that direction he shouted an answer. Then he ran out into the darkness, followed by Peter. Another avalanche of wind gathered at their heels, driving them on like the crest of a flood. In the first force of it, Jolly Roger stumbled and fell to his knees, and in that moment he saw very faintly the glow of his light at the opening in the snow dune. A realization of his deadly peril, if he lost sight of the light, flashed upon him. Again and again he called into the night. After that, bowing his head in the fury of the storm, he plunged on deeper into darkness. A sudden wild thought seized upon his soul and thrilled him into forgetfulness of the light and the snow dune and his own safety. In the heart of this mad world he had heard a voice. He no longer doubted it. And the voice was a woman's voice. Could it be Nada? Was it possible she had followed him after his flight, determined to find him and share his fate? His heart pounded. Who else, of all the women in the world, could be following his trail across the barrens, 1,000 miles from civilization? He began to shout her name. Nada! 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 And hidden in the gloom at his side, Peter barked. Storm and darkness swallowed them. The last faint gleam of the alcohol lamp died out. Jolly Roger did not look back. Blindly he stumbled ahead, counting his footsteps as he went, and shouting Nada's name. Twice he thought he heard a reply, and each time the will-o'-the-wisp voice seemed to be still farther ahead of him. Then, with a fiercer blast of the wind beating upon his back, he stumbled and fell forward upon his face. His hand reached out and touched the thing that had tripped him. It was not snow. His naked fingers clutched in something soft and furry. It was a man's coat. He could feel buttons, a belt, and the sudden thrill of a bearded face. He stood up. The wind was wailing off over the barren again, leaving an instant of stillness about him, and he shouted, "Nada! Nada! Nada!" An answer came so quickly that it startled him, not one voice, but two, three, and one of them the shrill agonized cry of a woman. They came toward him as he continued to shout, until a few feet away he could make out a gray blur moving through the gloom. He went to it, staggering under the weight of the man he had found in the snow. The blur was made up of two men dragging a sledge, and behind the sledge was a third figure, moaning in the darkness. "I found someone in the snow!" Jolly Roger shouted. "Here he is!" He dropped his burden, and the last of his words were twisted by a fresh blast of the storm. But the figure behind the sledge had heard, and Jolly Roger saw her indistinctly at his feet, shielding the man he had found with her arms and body, and crying out a name which he could not understand in that howling of the wind. But a thing like cold steel sank into his heart, and he knew it was not Nada he had found this night on the Barren. He placed the unconscious man on the sledge, believing he was dead. The girl was crying out something to him, unintelligible in the storm, and one of the men shouted in a thick, throaty voice which he could not understand. Jolly Roger felt the weight of him as he staggered in the wind, fighting to keep his feet, and he knew he was ready to drop down in the snow and die. "It's only a step," he shouted. "Can you make it?" His words reached the ears of the others. The girl swayed through the darkness and gripped his arm. The two men began to tug at the sledge, and Jolly Roger seized the rope between them, wondering why there were no dogs, and faced the driving of the storm. It seemed an interminable time before he saw the faint glow of the alcohol lamp. The last 50 feet was like struggling against an irresistible hail from machine guns. Then came the shelter of the dune. One at a time, McKay helped to drag them through the hole which he used for a door. For a space his vision was blurred, and he saw through the hazy film of storm blindness the gray faces and heavily coated forms of those he had rescued. The man he had found in the snow he placed on his blankets, and the girl fell down upon her knees beside him. It was then Jolly Roger began to see more clearly, and in that same instant came a shock as unexpected as the smash of dynamite under his feet. The girl had thrown back her parkee and was sobbing over the man on the blankets, and calling him father. She was not like Nada. Her hair was in thick, dark coils, and she was older. She was not pretty, now. Her face was twisted by the brutal beating of the storm, and her eyes were nearly closed. But it was the man Jolly Roger stared at, while his heart choked inside him. He was grizzled and gray-bearded, with military mustaches and a bald head. He was not dead. His eyes were open, and his blue lips were struggling to speak to the girl, whose blindness kept her from seeing that he was alive. And the coat which he wore was the regulation service garment of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. Slowly McKay turned, wiping the film of snow sweat from his eyes, and stared at the other two. One of them had sunk down with his back to the snow wall. He was a much younger man, possibly not over 30, and his face was ghastly. The third lay where he had fallen from exhaustion after crawling through the hole. Both wore service coats, with holsters at their sides. The man against the snow wall was making an effort to rise. He sagged back, and grinned up apologetically at McKay. "Damn fine of you, old man," he mumbled between blistered lips. "I'm Porter, N Division, taking Superintendent Tavish to Fort Churchill. Tavish and his daughter. Made a hell of a mess of it, haven't I?" He struggled to his knees. "There's brandy in our kit. It might help, over there," and he nodded toward the girl and the gray-bearded man on the blankets. End of chapter 13. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 14 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond, by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 14. Jolly Roger did not answer, but crawled through the hole and found the sledge in the outer darkness. He heard Peter coming after him, and he saw Porter's bloodless face in the illumination of the alcohol lamp, where he waited to help him with the dunnage. In those seconds he fought to get a grip on himself. A quarter of an hour ago he had laughed at the thought of the law. Never had it seemed to be so far away from him, and never had he been more utterly isolated from the world. His mind was still a bit dazed by the thing that had happened. The police had not trailed him. They had not ferreted him out, nor had they stumbled upon him by accident. It was he who had gone out into the night and deliberately dragged them in. Of all the trickery fate had played upon him, this was the least to be expected. His mind began to work more swiftly as in darkness he cut the babiche cordage that bound the patrol dunnage to the sledge. N Division, he told himself, was away over in Athabasca country. He had never heard of Porter, nor of Superintendent Tavish, and inasmuch as the outfit was evidently a special escort to Fort Churchill, it was very likely that Porter and his companions would not be thinking of outlaws, and especially of Jolly Roger McKay. This was his one chance. To attempt an escape through the blizzard was not only a desperate hazard, it was death. There were only 2 packs on the sledge, and these he passed through the hole to Porter. A few moments later he was holding a flask of liquor to the lips of the gray-bearded man, while the girl looked at him with eyes that were widening as the snow sting left them. Tavish gulped, and his mittened hand closed on the girl's arm. "I'm all right, Joe," he mumbled. "All right." His eyes met McKay's, and then took in the snow walls of the dugout. They were deep, piercing eyes, overhung by shaggy brows. Jolly Roger felt the intentness of their gaze as he gave the girl a swallow of the brandy, and then passed the flask to Porter. "You have saved our lives," said Tavish, in a voice that was clearer. "I don't just understand how it happened. I remember stumbling in the darkness, and being unable to rise. I was behind the sledge. Porter and Breault were dragging it, and Josephine, my daughter, was sheltered under the blankets. After that—" He paused, and Jolly Roger explained how it all had come about. He pointed to Peter. It was the dog, he said. Peter had insisted there was someone outside, and they had taken a chance by going in search of them. He was John Cummings, a fox trapper, and the storm had caught him 50 miles from his cabin. He was traveling without a dog sledge, and had only a pack outfit. Breault, the 3rd man, had regained his wind, and was listening to him. One look at his dark, thin face told McKay that he was the wilderness man of the 3. He was staring at Jolly Roger in a strange sort of way. And then, as if catching himself, he nodded and began rubbing his frosted face with handfuls of snow. Porter had thrown off his heavy coat and was unpacking one of the dunnage sacks. He and the girl seemed to have suffered less than the other 2. Jo, the girl, was looking at him. And then her eyes turned to Jolly Roger. They were large, fine eyes, wide open and clear now. There was something of splendid strength about her as she smiled at McKay. She was not of the hysterical sort. He could see that. "If we could have some hot soup," she suggested. "May we?" There was gratitude in her eyes, which she made no attempt to express in words. Jolly Roger liked her, and Peter crept up behind her and watched her as she followed Breault's example, and rubbed the cheeks of the bearded man with snow. "There's an alcohol stove in the other pack," said Breault, with his hard, narrow eyes fixed steadily on Jolly Roger's face. "By the way, what did you say your name was?" "Cummings. John Cummings." Breault made no answer. During the next half hour Jolly Roger felt stealing over him a growing sense of uneasiness. They drank soup and ate bannock. It grew warm, and the girl threw off the heavy fur garment that enveloped her. Color returned into her cheeks. Her eyes were bright, and in her voice was a tremble of happiness at finding warmth and life where she had expected death. Porter's friendliness was almost brotherly. He explained what had happened. 2 rascally Chippewyans had deserted them, stealing off into darkness and storm with both dog teams and one of their sledges. After that they had fought on, seeking for a drift into which they might dig a refuge. But the Barren was as smooth as a table. They had shouted, and Miss Tavish had screamed, not because they expected to find assistance, but on account of Tavish falling in the storm and losing himself. It was quite a joke, Porter thought, that Superintendent Tavish, one of the iron men of the service, should have given up the ghost so easily. Tavish smiled grimly. They were all in good humor and happy, with the possible exception of Breault. Not once did he laugh or smile. Yet Jolly Roger noted that each time he spoke the others were specially attentive. There was something repressive and mysterious about the man, and the girl would cut herself short in the middle of a laugh if he happened to speak, and the softness of her mouth would harden in an instant. He understood the significance of her gladness and of Porter's, for twice he saw their hands come together and their fingers entwine. And in their eyes was something which they could not hide when they looked at each other. But Breault puzzled him. He did not know that Breault was the best man-hunter in N Division, which reached from Athabasca Landing to the Arctic Ocean, or that up and down the 2,000-mile stretch of the Three River country he was known as Shingoos, the Ferret. The girl fell asleep first that night, with her cheek on her father's shoulder. Breault, the Ferret, rolled himself in a blanket and breathed deeply. Porter still smoked his pipe and looked wistfully at the pale face of Josephine Tavish. He smiled a bit proudly at McKay. "She's mine," he whispered. "We're going to be married." Jolly Roger wanted to reach over and grip his hand. He nodded, a little lump coming in his throat. "I know how you feel," he said. "When I heard her calling out there, it made me think of a girl down south." "Down south?" queried Porter. "Why down south, if you care for her, and you up here?" McKay shrugged his shoulders. He had said too much. Neither he nor Porter knew that Breault's eyes were half open, and that he was listening. Jolly Roger held up a hand, as if something in the wailing of the storm had caught his attention. "We'll have 2 or 3 days of this. Better turn in, Porter. I'm going to dig out another room for Miss Tavish. I'm afraid she'll need the convenience of a private room before we're able to move. It's an easy job and passes the time away." "I'll help," offered Porter. For an hour they worked, using McKay's snowshoes as shovels. During that hour Breault did not close his eyes. A curious smile curled his thin lips as he watched Jolly Roger. And when at last Porter turned in and slept, the Ferret sat up and stretched himself. McKay had finished his room and was beginning a tunnel which would lead as a back door out of the drift, when Breault came in and picked up the snowshoe which Porter had used. "I'll take my turn," he said. "I'm a bit nervous and not at all sleepy, Cummings." He began digging into the snow. "Been long in this country?" he asked. "3 winters. It's a good red fox country, with now and then a silver and a black." Breault grunted. "You must have met Cassidy, then," he said casually, without looking at McKay. "Corporal Terence Cassidy. This is his country." Jolly Roger did not look up from his work of digging. "Yes, I know him. Met him last winter. Red-headed. A nice chap. I like him. You know him?" "Entered the service together," said Breault. "But he's unlucky. For 2 or 3 years he has been on the trail of a man named McKay. Jolly Roger, they call him. Jolly Roger McKay. Ever hear of him?" Jolly Roger nodded. "Cassidy told me about him when he was at my cabin. From what I've heard, I rather like him." "Who? Cassidy or Jolly Roger?" "Both." For the first time the ferret leveled his eyes at his companion. They were mystifying eyes, never appearing to open fully, but remaining half closed, as if to conceal whatever thought might lie behind them. McKay felt their penetration. It was like a cold chill entering into him, warning him of a menace deadlier than the storm. "Haven't any idea where one might come upon this Jolly Roger, have you?" "No." "You see, he thinks he killed a man down south. Well, he didn't. The man lived. If you happen to see him at any time, give him that information, will you?" Jolly Roger thrust his head and shoulders into the growing tunnel. "Yes, I will." He knew Breault was lying, and also knew that back of the narrow slits of Breault's eyes was the cunning of a fox. "You might also tell him the law has a mind to forgive him for sticking up that Free Trader's post a few years ago." Jolly Roger turned with his snowshoe piled high with a load of snow. "I'll tell him that, too," he said, chuckling at the obviousness of the other's trap. "What do you think my cabin is, Breault? A rest for homeless outlaws?" Breault grinned. It was an odd sort of grin, and Jolly Roger caught it over his shoulder. When he returned from dumping his load, Breault said, "You see, we know this Jolly Roger fellow is spending the winter somewhere up here, and Cassidy says there's a girl down south—" Jolly Roger's face was hidden in the tunnel. "Who would like to see him," finished Breault. When McKay turned toward him, the ferret was carelessly lighting his pipe. "I remember. Cassidy told me about this girl," said Jolly Roger. "He said, some day, he would trap this man through the girl. So if I happen to meet Jolly Roger McKay and send him back to the girl, it'll help out the law. Is that it, Breault? And is there any reward tacked to it? Anything in it for me?" Breault was looking at him in the pale light of the alcohol lamp, puffing out tobacco smoke, and with that odd twist of a smile about his thin lips. "Listen to the storm," he said. "I think it's getting worse. Cummings." Suddenly he held out a hand to Peter, who sat near the lamp, his bright eyes fixed watchfully on the stranger. "Nice dog you have, Cummings. Come here, Peter. Peter! Peter!" Tight ringers seemed to grip at McKay's throat. He had not spoken Peter's name since the rescue of Breault. "Peter! Peter!" The ferret was smiling affably. But Peter did not move. He made no response to the outstretched hand. His eyes were steady and challenging. In that moment McKay wanted to hug him up in his arms. The ferret laughed. "He's a good dog. A very good dog, Cummings. I like a one-man dog, and I also like a one-dog man. That's what Jolly Roger McKay is, if you ever happen to meet him. Travels with one dog. An Airedale, with whiskers on him like a Mormon. And his name is Peter. Funny name for a dog, isn't it?" He faced the outer room, stretching his long arms over his head. "I'm going to try sleep again, Cummings. Good night, and Mother of Heaven, listen to the wind!" "Yes, it's a bad night," said McKay. He looked at Peter when Breault was gone, and his heart was beating fast. He could hear the wind, too. It was sweeping over the barren more fiercely than before, and the sound of it brought a steely glitter into his eyes. This time he could not run away from the law. Flight meant death. And Breault knew it. He was in a trap built by himself. That is, if Breault had guessed the truth, and he believed he had. There was only one way out, and that meant fight. He went into the outer room for his pack and a blanket. He did not look at Breault, but he knew the man's narrow eyes were following him. He left the alcohol lamp burning, but in his own room, after he had spread out his bed, he extinguished the light. Then, very quietly, he dug a hole through the snow partition between the two rooms. He waited for 10 minutes before he thrust a fingertip through the last thin crust of snow. With his eye close to the aperture he could see Breault. The ferret was sitting up and leaning toward Porter, who was sleeping an arm's length away. He reached over and touched him on the shoulder. Jolly Roger widened the snow slit another inch, straining his ears to hear. He could see Tavish and the girl asleep. In another moment Porter was sitting up, with the ferret's hand gripping his arm warningly. Breault motioned toward the inner room, and Porter was silent. Then Breault bent over and began to whisper. Jolly Roger could hear only the indistinct monotone of his voice, but he could see very clearly the change that came into Porter's face. His eyes widened, and he stared toward the inner room, making a movement as if to rouse Tavish and the girl. The ferret stopped him. "Don't get excited. Let them sleep." McKay heard that much, and no more. For some time after that the two men sat close together, conversing in whispers. There was an exultant satisfaction in Porter's clean-cut face, as well as in Breault's. Jolly Roger watched them until Breault extinguished the second lamp. Then he lightly plugged the hole in the partition with snow, and reached out in the darkness until his hand found Peter. "They think they've got us, boy," he whispered. "They think they've got us." Very quietly they lay for an hour. McKay did not sleep, and Peter was wide awake. At the end of that hour Jolly Roger crept on his hands and knees to the doorway and listened. One after another he picked out the steady breathing of the sleepers. Then he began feeling his way around the wall of his room until he came to a place where the snow was very soft. "An air drift," he whispered to Peter, close at his shoulder. "We'll fool 'em, boy, and we'll fight if we have to." He began worming his head and shoulders and body into the air drift like a gimlet. A foot at a time he burrowed himself through, heaving his body up and down and sideways to pack the light snow, leaving a round tunnel 2 feet in diameter behind him. Within an hour he had come to the outer crust on the windward side of the big snow dune. He did not break through this crust, which was as tough as crystal glass, but lay quietly for a time and listened to the sweep of the wind outside. It was warm and very comfortable, and he had half dozed off before he caught himself back into wakefulness and returned to his room. The mouth of his tunnel he packed with snow. After that he wound the blanket about him and gave himself up calmly to sleep. Only Peter lay awake after that. And it was Peter who roused Jolly Roger in what would have been the early dawn outside the snow dune. McKay felt his restless movement and opened his eyes. A faint light was illuminating his room, and he sat up. In the other room the alcohol lamp was burning again. He could hear movement, and voices that were very low and indistinct. Carefully he dug out once more the little hole in the snow wall, and widened the slit. Breault and Tavish were asleep, but Porter was sitting up, and close behind him sat the girl. Her coiled hair was loosened and fallen over her shoulders. There was no sign of drowsiness in her wide-open eyes as they stared at the door between the two rooms. McKay could see her hand clasping Porter's arm. Porter was talking, with his face so close to her bent head that his lips touched her hair, and though Jolly Roger could understand no word that was spoken, he knew Porter was whispering the exciting secret of his identity to Josephine Tavish. He could see, for a moment, a shadow of protest in her face. He could hear the quick, sibilant whisper of her voice, and Porter cautioned her with a finger at her lips, and made a gesture toward the sleeping Tavish. Then his fingers closed about her uncoiled hair as he drew her to him. McKay watched the long kiss between them. The girl drew away quickly then, and Porter tucked the blanket about her when she lay down beside her father. After that he stretched out again beside Breault. Jolly Roger guessed what had happened. The girl had awakened, a bit nervous, and had roused Porter and asked him to relight the alcohol lamp. And Porter had taken advantage of the opportunity to tell her of the interesting discovery which Breault had made, and to kiss her. McKay stroked Peter's scrawny neck and listened. He could no longer hear the storm, and he wondered if the fury of it was spent. Every few minutes he looked through the slit in the snow wall. The last time, half an hour after Porter had returned to his blanket, Josephine Tavish was sitting up. She was very wide awake. McKay watched her as she rose slowly to her knees, and then to her feet. She bent over Porter and Breault to make sure they were asleep, and then came straight toward the door of his room. He lay back on his blanket with the fingers of one hand gripped closely about Peter. "Be quiet, boy," he whispered. "Be quiet." He could see the shutting out of light at his door as the girl stood there, listening for his breathing. He breathed heavily, and before he closed his eyes he saw Josephine Tavish coming toward him. In a moment she was bending over him. He could feel the soft caress of her loose hair on his face and hands. Then she knelt quietly down beside him, stroking Peter with her hand, and shook him lightly by the shoulder. "Jolly Roger," she whispered. "Jolly Roger McKay." He opened his eyes, looking up at the white face in the gloom. "Yes," he replied softly. "What is it, Miss Tavish?" He could hear the choking breath in her throat as her fingers tightened at his shoulder. She bent her face still nearer to him, until her hair cluttered his throat and breast. "You are awake?" "Yes." "Then listen to me. If you are Jolly Roger McKay, you must get away, somewhere. You must go before Breault awakens in the morning. I think the storm is over. There is no wind. And if you are here when day comes—" Her fingers loosened. Jolly Roger reached out, and somewhere in the darkness he found her hand. It clasped his own, firm, warm, thrilling. "I thank you for what you have done," she whispered. "But the law, and Breault, they have no mercy." She was gone, swiftly and silently, and McKay looked through the slit in the wall until she was with her father again. In the gloom he drew Peter close to him. "We're up against it again, Pied Bot," he confided under his breath. "We've got to take another chance." He worked without sound, and in a quarter of an hour his pack was ready, and the entrance to his tunnel dug out. He went into the outer room then, where Josephine Tavish was awake. Jolly Roger pantomimed his desire as she sat up. He wanted something from one of the packs. She nodded. On his knees he fumbled in the dunnage, and when he rose to his feet, facing the girl, her eyes opened wide at what he held in his hand. A small packet of old newspapers her father was taking to the factor at Fort Churchill. She saw the hungry, apologetic look in his eyes, and her woman's heart understood. She smiled gently at him, and her lips formed an unvoiced whisper of gratitude as he turned to go. At the door he looked back. He thought she was beautiful then, with her shining hair and eyes, and her lips parted, and her hands half reaching out to him, as if in that moment of parting she was giving him courage and faith. Suddenly she pressed the palms of her fingers to her mouth and sent the kiss of benediction to him through the twilight glow of the snow room. A moment later, crawling through his tunnel with Peter close behind him, there was an exultant singing in Jolly Roger's heart. Again he was fleeing from the law, but always, as Yellow Bird had predicted in her sorcery, there were happiness and hope in his going. And always there was someone to urge him on, and to take a pride in him, like Josephine Tavish. He broke through the dune crust at the end of his tunnel, and crawled out into the thick, gray dawn of a barren land day. The sky was heavy overhead, and the wind had died out. It was the beginning of the brief lull which came in the second day of the great storm. McKay laughed softly as he sensed the odds against them. "We'll be having the storm at our heels again before long, Pied-Bot," he said. "We'd better make for the timber a dozen miles south." He struck out, circling the dune, so that he was traveling straight away from the first hole he had cut through the shell of the drift. From that door, made by the outlaw who had saved them, Josephine Tavish watched the shadowy forms of man and dog until they were lost in the gray-white chaos of a frozen world. End of chapter 14. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 15 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 15. Through the blizzard Jolly Roger made his way a score of miles southward from the big dune on the Barren. For a day and a night he made his camp in the scrub timber which edged the vast treeless tundras reaching to the Arctic. He believed he was safe, for the unceasing wind and the blasts of shot-like snow filled his tracks a few moments after they were made. He struck a straight line for his cabin after that first day and night in the scrub timber. The storm was still a thing of terrific force out on the Barren, but in the timber he was fairly well sheltered. He was convinced the police patrol would find his cabin very soon after the storm had worn itself out. Porter and Tavish did not trouble him, but from Breault he knew there was no getting away. Breault would nose out his cabin, and for that reason he was determined to reach it first. The second night he did not sleep. His mind was a wild thing, wild as a loup-garou seeking out its ghostly trails. It passed beyond his mastery, keeping sleep away from him, though he was dead tired. It carried him back over all the steps of his outlawry, visioning for him the score of times he had escaped, as he was narrowly escaping now. And it pictured for him, like a creature of inquisition, the tightening net ahead of him, the final futility of all his effort. And at last, as if moved by pity to ease his suffering a little, it brought him back vividly to the green valley, the flowers and the blue skies of Cragg's Ridge, and Nada. It was like a dream. At times he could scarcely assure himself that he had actually lived those weeks and months of happiness down on the edge of civilization. It seemed impossible that Nada had come like an angel into his life down there, and that she had loved him, even when he confessed himself a fugitive from the law and had entreated him to take her with him. He closed his eyes, and that last roaring night of storm at Cragg's Ridge was about him again. He was in the little old missioner's cabin, with thunder and lightning rending earth and sky outside, and Nada was in his arms, her lips against his, the piteous heartbreak of despair in her eyes. Then he saw her, a moment later, a crumpled heap down beside the chair, the disheveled glory of her hair hiding her white face from him as he hesitated for a single instant before opening the door and plunging out into the night. With a cry he sprang up, dashing the vision from him, and threw fresh fuel on the fire. And he cried out the same old thought to Peter. "It would have been murder for us to bring her, Pied-Bot. It would have been murder." He looked about him at the swirling chaos outside the rim of light made by his fire, and listening to the moaning of the wind over the tree-tops. Beyond the circle of light, the dry snow, which crunched like sand under his feet, was lost in ghostly gloom. It was 40 degrees below zero, and he was glad, even with this sickness of despair in his heart, that she was not a fugitive with him tonight. Yet he built up a little make-believe world for himself as he sat with a blanket hugged close about him, staring into the fire. In 100 different ways he saw her face, a will-o'-the-wisp thing amid the flames, an elusive, very girlish, almost childish face, yet always with the light of a woman's soul shining in it. That was the miracle which startled him at last. It seemed as if the fiction he built up in his despair transformed itself subtly into fact, and that her soul had come to him from out of the Southland, and was speaking to him with eyes which never changed or faltered in their adoration, their faith, and their courage. She seemed to come to him, to creep into his arms under the folds of the blanket, and he sensed the soft crush of her hair, the touch of her lips, the warm encircling of her arms about his neck. Closer to him pressed the mystery, until the beating of her heart was a living pulse against him. And then suddenly, as an irresistible impulse closed his arms to hold the spirit to him, his eyes were drawn to the heart of the fire, and he saw there, for an instant, wide-eyed and speaking to him, the face of Yellow Bird, the Indian sorceress. The flames crept up the long braids of her hair, her lips moved, and then she was gone, but slowly, like a ghost slipping upward into the mist of smoke and night. Peter heard his master's cry. And after that Jolly Roger rose up and threw off the blanket and walked back and forth until his feet trod a path in the snow. He told himself it was madness to believe, and yet he believed. Faith fought itself back into that dark citadel of his heart from which for a time it had been driven. New courage lighted up again the black chaos of his soul. And at last he fell down on his knees and gripped Peter's shaggy head between his two hands. "Pied-Bot, she said everything would come out right in the end," he cried, a new note in his voice. "That's what Yellow Bird told us, wasn't it? Mebby they would have burned her as a witch a long time ago because she's a sorceress, and says she can send her soul out of her body and see what we can't see. But we believe." His voice choked up, and he laughed. "They were both here tonight," he added, "Nada and Yellow Bird. And I believe I know what it means." He stood up again, and Peter saw the old smile on his master's lips as Jolly Roger looked up into the swirling black canopy of the spruce tops. And the wailing of the storm seemed no longer to hold menace and taunt, but in it he heard the whisper of fierce, strong voices urging upon him the conviction that had already swept indecision from his heart. And then he said, holding out his arms as if encompassing something which he could not see, "Peter, we're going back to Nada." Dawn was a scarcely perceptible thing when it came. Darkness seemed to fade a little, that was all. Frosty shapes took form in the gloom, and the spruce tops became tangible in an abyss of sepulchral shadow overhead. Through this beginning of the Barren Land day Jolly Roger set out in the direction of his cabin, and in his blood was that new singing thing of fire and warmth that more than made up for the hours of sleep he had lost during the night. The storm was dying out, he thought, and it was growing warmer, Yet the wind whistled and raved in the open spaces, and his thermometer registered the 40th and a fraction degree below zero. The air he breathed was softer, he fancied, yet it was still heavy with the stinging shot of blizzard, and where yesterday he had seen only the smothering chaos of twisted spruce and piled-up snow, there was now, as the pale day broadened, his old wonderland of savage beauty, awaiting only a flash of sunlight to transform it into the pure glory of a thing indescribable. But the sun did not come, and Jolly Roger did not miss it overmuch, for his heart was full of Nada and athrill with the inspiration of his home-going. "That's what it means, going home," he said to Peter, who nosed close in the patch of his snowshoes. "There's 1,000 miles between us and Cragg's Ridge, 1,000 miles of snow and ice, and hell, maybe, but we'll make it." He was sure of himself now. It was as if he had come up from out of the shadow of a great sickness. He had been unwise. He had not reasoned as a man should reason. The hangman might be waiting for him at Cragg's Ridge, down on the rim of civilization, but that same grim executioner was also pursuing close at his heels. He would always be pursuing in the form of a Breault, a Cassidy, a Tavish, or a somebody else of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. It would be that way until the end came. And when the end did come, when they finally got him, the blow would be easier at Cragg's Ridge than up here in the edge of the Barren Land. And again there was hope, a wild, almost unbelievable hope that with Nada he might find that place which Yellow Bird, the sorceress, had promised for them, that mystery place of safety and of happiness which she had called the country beyond, where all would end well. He had not the faith of Yellow Bird's people. He was not superstitious enough to believe fully in her sorcery, except that he seized upon it as a drowning man might grip at a floating seaweed. Yet was the undercurrent of hope so persistent that at times it was near faith. Up to this hour Yellow Bird's sorcery had brought him nothing but the truth. For him she had conjured the spirits of her people, and these spirits, speaking through Yellow Bird's lips, had saved him from Cassidy at the fishing camp, and had performed the miracle on the shore of Wollaston, and had predicted the salvation that had come to him out on the Barren. And so, was it not conceivable that the other would also come true? But these visions came to him only in flashes. As he traveled through the hours, the one vital desire of his being was to bring himself physically into the presence of Nada, to feel the wild joy of her in his arms once more, the crush of her lips to his, the caress of her hands in their old sweet way at his face, and to hear her voice, the girl's voice with the woman's soul behind it, crying out its undying love, as he had last heard it that night in the missioner's cabin many months ago. After this had happened, then, if fate decreed it so, all other things might end. Breault, the ferret, might come. Or Porter. Or that somebody else who was always on his trail. If the game finished thus, he would be satisfied. When he stopped to make a pot of black tea and warm a snack to eat, Jolly Roger tried to explain this new meaning of life to Peter. "The big thing we must do is to get there safely," he said, already beginning to make plans in the back of his head. And then he went on, building up his fabric of new hope before Peter, while he crunched his luncheon of toasted bannock and fat bacon. There was something joyous and definite in his voice, which entered into Peter's blood and body. There was even a note of excitement in it, and Peter's whiskers bristled with fresh courage, and his eyes gleamed and his tail thumped the snow comprehendingly. It was like having a master come back to him from the dead. And Jolly Roger even laughed, softly, under his breath. "This is February," he said. "We ought to make it late in March. I mean Cragg's Ridge, Pied-Bot." After that they went on, traveling hard to reach their cabin before the darkness of night, which would drop upon them like a thick blanket at 4 o'clock. In these last hours there pressed even more heavily upon Jolly Roger that growing realization of the vastness and emptiness of the world. It was as if blindness had dropped from his eyes, and he saw the naked truth at last. Out of this world everything had emptied itself until it held only Nada. Only she counted. Only she held out her arms to him, entreating him to keep for her that life in his body which meant so little in all other ways. He thought of one of the little worn books which he carried in his shoulder pack, Jeanne d'Arc. As she had fought, with the guidance of God, so he believed the blue-eyed girl down at Cragg's Ridge was fighting for him, and had sent her spirit out in quest of him. And he was going back to her. Going. The last word, as it came from his lips, meant that nothing would stop them. He almost shouted it, and Peter answered. In spite of their effort, darkness closed in on them. With the first dusk of this night there came sudden lulls in which the blizzard seemed to have exhausted itself. Jolly Roger read the signs. By tomorrow there would be no storm, and Breault the ferret would be on the trail again, along with Porter and Tavish. It was his old craft, his old cunning, that urged him to go on. Strangely, he prayed for the blizzard not to give up the ghost. Something must be accomplished before its fury was spent, and he was glad when after each lull he heard again the moaning and screeching of it over the open spaces, and the slashing together of spruce tops where there was cover. In a chaos of gloom they came to the low ridge which reached across an open swamp of tundra to the finger of shelter where the cabin was built. An hour later they were at its door. Jolly Roger opened it and staggered in. For a space he stood leaning against the wall while his lungs drank in the warmer air. The intake of his breath made a whistling sound, and he was surprised to find himself so near exhaustion. He heard the thud of Peter's body as it collapsed to the floor. "Tired, Pied-Bot?" It was difficult for his storm-beaten lips to speak the words. Peter thumped his tail. The rat-tap-tap of it came in one of those lulls of the storm which Jolly Roger had begun to dread. "I hope it keeps up another 2 hours," he said, wetting his lips to take the stiffness out of them. "If it doesn't—" He was thinking of Breault as he drew off his mittens and fumbled for a match. It was Breault he feared. The ferret would find his cabin and his trail if the storm died out too soon. He lighted the tin lamp on his table, and after that, assured that wastefulness would cost him nothing now, he set 2 bear drip candles going, one at each end of the cabin. The illumination filled the single room. There was little for it to reveal, the table he had made, a chair, a battered little sheet-iron stove, and the humped-up blanket in his bunk, under which he had stored the remainder of his possessions. Back of the stove was a pile of dry wood, and in another 5 minutes the roar of flames in the chimney mingled with the fresh bluster of the wind outside. Defying the exhaustion of limbs and body, Jolly Roger kept steadily at work. He threw off his heavier garments as the freezing atmosphere of the room became warmer, and prepared for a feast. "We'll call it Christmas, and have everything we've got, Pied-Bot. We'll cook a quart of prunes instead of 6. No use stinting ourselves tonight." Even Peter was amazed at the prodigality of his master. An hour later they ate, and McKay drank a quart of hot coffee before he was done. Half of his fatigue was gone, and he sat back for a few minutes to finish off with a luxury of his pipe. Peter, gorged with caribou meat, stretched himself out to sleep. But his eyes did not close. His master puzzled him. For after a little Jolly Roger put on his heavy coat and parkee and pocketed his pipe. After that he slipped the straps of his pack over head and shoulders, and then, even more to Peter's bewilderment, emptied a quart bottle of kerosene over the pile of dry wood behind the hot stove. To this he touched a lighted match. His next movement drew from Peter a startled yelp. With a single thrust of his foot he sent the stove crashing into the middle of the floor. Half an hour later, when Peter and Jolly Roger looked back from the crest of the ridge, a red pillar of flame lighted up the gloomy chaos of the unpeopled world they were leaving behind them. The wind was driving fiercely from the barren, and with it came stinging volleys of the fine drift snow. In the teeth of it, Roger McKay stared back. "It's a good fire," he mumbled in his hood. "Half an hour, and it will be out. There'll be nothing for Breault to find if this wind keeps up another 2 hours, nothing but drift snow, with no sign of trail or cabin." He struck out, leaving the shelter of the ridge. Straight south he went, keeping always in the open spaces where the wind-swept drift covered his snowshoe trail almost as soon as it was made. Darkness did not trouble him now. The open barren was ahead, miles of it, while only a little to the westward was the shelter of timber. Twice he blundered to the edge of this timber, but quickly set his course again in the open with the wind always quartering at his back. He could only guess how long he kept on. The time came when he began to count the swing of his snowshoes, measuring off half a mile or a mile, and then beginning over again, until at last the achievement of 500 steps seemed to take an immeasurable length of time and great effort. Like the ache of a tooth came the first warning of snowshoe cramp in his legs. In the black night he grinned. He knew what it meant, a warning as deadly as swimmer's cramp in deep water. If he continued much longer, he would be crawling on his hands and knees. Quickly he turned in the direction of the timber. He had traveled 3 hours, he thought, since abandoning his cabin to the flames. Another half hour, with the caution of slower, shorter steps, brought him to the timber. Luck was with him, and he cried aloud to Peter as he felt himself in the darkness of a dense cover of spruce and balsam. He freed himself from his entangled snowshoes and went on deeper into the shelter. It became warmer, and they could feel no longer a breath of the wind. He unloaded his pack and drew from it a jackpine torch, dried in his cabin and heavy with pitch. Shortly the flare of this torch lighted up their refuge for a dozen paces about them. In the illumination of it, moving it from place to place, he gathered dry firewood and with his axe cut down green spruce for the smoldering backfire that would last until morning. By the time the torch had consumed itself, the fire was burning, and where Jolly Roger had scraped away the snow from the thick carpet of spruce needles underfoot, he piled a thick mass of balsam boughs, and in the center of the bed he buried himself, wrapped warmly in his blankets, and with Peter snuggled close at his side. Through dark hours the green spruce fire burned slowly and steadily. For a long time there was wailing of wind out in the open. But at last it died away, and utter stillness filled the world. No life moved in these hours which followed the giving up of the big storm's last gasping breath. Slowly the sky cleared. Here and there a star burned through. But Jolly Roger and Peter, deep in the sleep of exhaustion, knew nothing of the change. End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 16 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. It was Peter who roused Jolly Roger many hours later. Peter nosing about the still burning embers of the fire, and at last muzzling his master's face with increasing anxiety. McKay sat up out of his nest of balsam boughs and blankets, and caught the bright glint of sunlight through the tree-tops. He rubbed his eyes and stared again to make sure. Then he looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock, and peering in the direction of the open he saw the white edge of it glistening in the unclouded blaze of a sun. It was the first sun, the first real sun, he had seen for many days, and with Peter he went to the rim of the Barren 100 yards distant. He wanted to shout. As far as he could see the white plain was ablaze with eye-blinding light, and never had the sky at Cragg's Ridge been clearer than the sky that was over him now. He returned to the fire, singing. Back through the months leapt Peter's memory to the time when his master had sung like that. It was in Indian Tom's cabin, with Cragg's Ridge just beyond the creek, and it was in those days before Terence Cassidy had come to drive them to another hiding place. In the happy days of Nada's visits, and of their trysts under the ridge, when even the little gray mother mouse lived in a paradise with her nest of babies in the box on their cabin shelf. He had almost forgotten, but it came back to him now. It was the old Jolly Roger, the old master come to life again. In the clear stillness of the morning one might have heard that shouting song half a mile away. But McKay was no longer afraid. As the storm seemed to have cleaned the world, so the sun cleared his soul of its last shadow of doubt. It was not merely an omen or a promise, but for him proclaimed a certainty. God was with him. Life was with him. His world was opening its arms to him again, and he sang as if Nada was only a mile away from him instead of 1,000. When he went on, after their breakfast, he laughed at the thought of Breault discovering their trail. The ferret would be more than human to do that after what wind and storm and fire had done for them. This first day of their pilgrimage into the Southland was a day of glory from its beginning until the setting of the sun. There was no cloud in the sky, and it grew warmer until Jolly Roger flung back the hood of his parkee and turned up the fur of his cap. That night 1,000,000 stars lighted the heaven. After this first day and night nothing could break down the hope and confidence of Jolly Roger and his dog. Peter knew they were going south, in which direction lay everything he had ever yearned for, and each night beside their campfire McKay made a note with pencil and paper and measured the distance they had come and the distance they had yet to go. Hope in a little while became certainty. Into his mind urged no thought of changes that might have taken place at Cragg's Ridge, or, if the thought did come, it caused him no uneasiness. Now that Jed Hawkins was dead, Nada would be with the little old missioner in whose care he had left her, and not for an instant did a doubt cloud the growing happiness of his anticipations. Breault and the hunters of the law were the one worry that lay ahead and behind him. If he outwitted them, he would find Nada waiting for him. Day after day they kept south and west, until they struck the Thelon, and then, through a country unmapped and at times terrific in its cold and storm, they fought steadily to the frozen regions of the Dubawnt waterways. Only once in the first 3 weeks did they seek human company. This was at a small Indian camp where Jolly Roger bartered for caribou meat and moccasins for Peter's feet. Twice between there and God's Lake they stopped at trappers' cabins. It was early in March when they struck the Lost Lake country, 300 miles from Cragg's Ridge. And here it was, buried under a blind of soft snow, that Peter nosed out the frozen carcass of a disemboweled buck which Boileau, the French trapper, had poisoned for wolves. Jolly Roger had built a fire and was warming half a pint of deer tallow for a baking of bannock when Peter dragged himself in, his rear legs already stiffening with the palsy of strychnine. In a dozen seconds McKay had the warm tallow down Peter's throat, to the last drop of it, and this he followed with another dose as quickly as he could heat it, and in the end Peter gave up what he had eaten. Half an hour later Boileau, who was eating his dinner, jumped up in wonderment when the door of his cabin was suddenly opened by a grim and white-faced man who carried the limp body of a dog in his arms. For a long time after this the shadow of death hung over the Frenchman's trapping shack. To Boileau, with his brotherly sympathy and regret that his poison bait had brought calamity, Peter was just dog. But when at last he saw the strong shoulders of the grim-faced stranger shaking over Peter's paralyzed body, and listening to the sobbing grief that broke in passionate protest from his white lips, he drew back a little awed. It seemed for a time that Peter was dead, and in those moments Jolly Roger put his arms about him and buried his despairing voice in Peter's scraggly neck, calling in a wild fit of anguish for him to come back, to live, to open his eyes again. Boileau, crossing himself, felt of Peter's body, and McKay heard his voice over him, saying that the dog was not dead, but that his heart was beating steadily, and that he thought the last stiffening blow of the poison was over. To McKay it was like bringing the dead back to life. He raised his head and drew away his arms, and knelt beside the bunk, stunned and mutely hopeful, while Boileau took his place and began dropping warm condensed milk down Peter's throat. In a little while Peter's eyes opened, and he gave a great sigh. Boileau looked up and shrugged his shoulders. "That was a good breath, monsieur," he said. "What is left of the poison has done its worst. He will live." A bit stupidly McKay rose to his feet. He swayed a little and for the first time sensed the hot tears that had blinded his eyes and wet his cheeks. And then there came a sobbing laugh out of his throat, and he went to the window of the Frenchman's shack and stared out into the white world, seeing nothing. He had stood in the presence of death many times before, but never had that presence choked up his heart as in this hour, when the soul of Peter, his comrade, had stood falteringly for a space halfway between the living and the dead. When he turned from the window, Boileau was covering Peter's body with blankets and a warm bearskin. And for many days thereafter Peter was nursed through the slow sickness which followed. An early spring came this year in the Northland. South of the Reindeer Waterway country the snows were disappearing late in March, and ice was rotting the first week in April. Winds came from the south and west, and the sun was warmer and clearer than Boileau had ever known it at the winter's end in Lost Lake country. It was in this first week of April that Peter was able to travel, and McKay pointed his trail once more for Cragg's Ridge. He left a part of his winter dunnage at Boileau's shack and went on light, figuring to reach Cragg's Ridge before the new goose moon had worn itself out in the west. But for a week Peter lagged, and until the darker red in the rims of his eyes cleared away, Jolly Roger checked the impetus of his travel so that the goose moon had faded out and the frog moon of May was in its full before they came down the last slope that dipped from the height of land to the forests and lakes of the lower country. And now, in these days, it seemed to Jolly Roger that a great kindness and not tragedy had delayed him so that his homecoming was in the gladness of spring. All about him was the sweetness and mystic whispering of new life just awakening. It was in the sky and the sun, it was underfoot, in the fragrance of the mold he trod upon, in the trees about him, and in the mate-chirping of the birds flocking back from the southland. His friends, the jays, were raucous and jaunty again, bullying and bluffing in the warmth of sunshine. The black glint of crows' wings flashed across the opens. The wood-sappers and pewees and big-eyed moose-birds were aflutter with the excitement of home planning. Partridges were feasting on the swelling poplar buds, and then, one glorious sunset, he heard the chirruping evening song of his first robin. And the next day they would reach Cragg's Ridge. Half of that last night he sat up, awake, or smoked in the glow of his fire, waiting for the dawn. With the first lifting of darkness he was traveling swiftly ahead of Peter, and the morning was only half gone, when he saw far ahead of him the great ridge which shut out Indian Tom's swamp, and Nada's plain, and Cragg's Ridge beyond it. It was noon when he stood at the crest of this. He was breathing hard, for to reach this last precious height from which he might look upon the country of Nada's home he had half run up its rock-strewn side. There, with his lungs gasping for air, his eager eyes shot over the country below him, and for a moment the significance of the thing which he saw did not strike him. And then, in another instant, it seemed that his heart choked up, like a fist suddenly tightened, and stopped its beating. Reaching away from him, miles upon miles of it, east, west, and south, was a dead and char-stricken world. Up to the foot of the ridge itself had come the devastation of flame, and where it had swept, months ago, there was now no sign of the glorious spring that lay behind him. He looked for Indian Tom's swamp, and where it had been there was no longer a swamp, but a stricken chaos of 10,000 black stubs, the shriven corpses of the spruce and cedar and jack-pines out of which the wolves had howled at night. He looked for the timber on Sucker Creek, where the little old missioner's cabin lay, and where he had dreamed that Nada would be waiting for him. And he saw no timber there, but only the littleness and emptiness of a blackened world. And then he looked to Cragg's Ridge, and along the bald crest of it, naked as death, he saw blackened stubs pointing skyward, painting desolation against the blue of the heaven beyond. A cry came from him, a cry of fear and of horror, for he was looking upon the fulfillment of Yellow Bird's prediction. He seemed to hear, whispering softly in his ears, the low, sweet voice of the sorceress, as on the night when she had told him that if he returned to Cragg's Ridge he would find a world that had turned black with ruin, and that it would not be there he would ever find Nada. After that one sobbing cry he tore like a madman down into the valley, traveling swiftly through the muck of fire and underfoot tangle, with Peter fighting behind him. Half an hour later he stood where the missioner's cabin had been, and he found only a ruin of ash and logs burned down to the earth. Where the trail had run, there was no longer a trail. A blight, grim and sickening, lay upon the earth that had been paradise. Peter heard the choking sound in his master's throat and chest. He, too, sensed the black shadow of tragedy, and cautiously he sniffed the air, knowing that at last they were home. And yet it was not home. Instinctively he had faced Cragg's Ridge, and Jolly Roger, seeing the dog's stiffened body pointing toward the break beyond which lay Nada's old home, felt a thrill of hope leap up within him. Possibly the farther plain had escaped the scourge of fire. If so, Nada would be there, and the missioner— He started for the break, a mile away. As he came nearer to it, his hope grew less, for he could see where the flame had swept in an inundating sea along Cragg's Ridge. They passed over the meadow where the thick young jack-pines, the red strawberries, and the blue violets had been, and Peter heard the strange sob when they came to the little hollow, the old trysting place where Nada had first given herself into his master's arms. And there it was that Peter forgot master and caution, and sped swiftly ahead to the break that cut the ridge in twain. When Jolly Roger came to that break and ran through it, he was staggering from the mad effort he had made. And then, all at once, the last of his wind came in a cry of gladness. He swayed against a rock, and stood there staring wild-eyed at what was before him. The world was as black ahead of him as it was behind. But Jed Hawkins' cabin was untouched. The fire had crept up to its very door, and there it had died. He went on the remaining 100 yards, and before the closed door of Nada's old home he found Peter standing stiff-legged and strange. He opened the door, and a damp chill touched his face. The cabin was empty, and the gloom and desolation of a grave filled the place. He stepped in, a moaning whisper of the truth coming to his lips. He heard the scurrying flight of a starved wood-rat, a flutter of loose papers, and then the silence of death fell about him. The door of Nada's little room was open, and he entered through it. The bed was naked, and there remained only the skeleton of things that had been. He moved now like a man numbed by a strange sickness, and Peter followed gloomily and silently in the footsteps of his master. They went outside, and a distance away Jolly Roger saw a thing rising up out of the char of fire, ugly and foreboding, like the evil spirit of desolation itself. It was a rude cross, made of saplings, up which the flames had licked their way, searing it grim and black. His hands clenched slowly, for he knew that under the cross lay the body of Jed Hawkins, the fiend who had destroyed his world. After that he re-entered the cabin and went into Nada's room, closing the door behind him, and for many minutes thereafter Peter remained outside guarding the outer door and hearing no sound or movement from within. When Jolly Roger came out, his face was set and white, and he looked where the thick forest had stood on that stormy night when he ran down the trail toward Mooney's cabin. There was no forest now. But he found the old tie-cutters' road, cluttered as it was with the debris of fire, and he knew when he came to that twist in the trail where long ago Jed Hawkins had lain dead on his back. Half a mile beyond he came to the railroad. Here it was that the fire had burned hottest, for as far as his vision went he could see no sign of life, or of forest green alight in the waning sun. And now there fell upon him, along with the desolation of despair, a something grimmer and more terrible, a thing that was fear. About him everywhere reached this graveyard of death, leaving no spot untouched. Was it possible that Nada and the missioner had not escaped its fury? The fear settled upon him more heavily as the sun went down and the gloom of evening came, bringing with it an unpleasant chill and a cloying odor of things burned dead. He did not talk to Peter now. There was a lamp in the cabin and wood behind the stove, and silently he built a fire and trimmed and lighted the wick when darkness came. And Peter, as if hiding from the ghosts of yesterday, slunk into a corner and lay there unmoving and still. And McKay did not get supper, nor did he smoke, but after a long time he carried his blankets into Nada's room and spread them out upon her bed. Then he put out the light and quietly laid himself down where, through the night of many a month and year, Nada had slept in the moon-glow. The moon was there tonight. The faint glow of it rose in the east, and swiftly it climbed over the ragged shoulder of Cragg's Ridge, flooding the blackened world with light, and filling the room with a soft and golden radiance. It was a moon undimmed, full and round and yellow, and it seemed to smile in through the window as if some living spirit in it had not yet missed Nada, and was embracing her in its glory. And now it came upon Jolly Roger why she had loved it even more than she had loved the sun, for through the little window it shut out all the rest of the world, and sitting up, he seemed to hear her heart beating at his side, and clearly he saw her face in the light of it, and her slim arms outreaching, as if to gather it to her breast. Thus, many times, she had told him, had she sat up in her bed to greet the moon and to look for the smiling face that was almost always there, the face of the man in the moon, her friend and playmate in the sky. For a space his heart leaped up, and then, as if discovery of the usurper in her room had come, a cloud swept over the face of the moon like a mighty hand, and darkness crowded him in. But the cloud sailed on, and the light drove out the gloom again. Then it was that Jolly Roger saw the old man in the moon was up and awake tonight, for never had he seen his face more clearly. Often had Nada pointed it out to him in her adorable faith that the old man loved her, telling him how this feature changed and that feature changed, how sometimes the old man looked sick and at others well, and how there were times when he smiled and was happy, and other times when he was sad and stern, and sat there in his castle in the sky, sunk in a mysterious grief which she could not understand. "And always I can tell whether I'm going to be glad or sorry by the look of the man in the moon," she had said to him. "He looks down and tells me even when the clouds are thick, and he can only peep through now and then. And he knows a lot about you, Mr. Jolly Roger, because I've told him everything." Very quietly Jolly Roger got up from the bed, and very strange seemed his manner to Peter as he walked through the outer room and into the night beyond. There he stood making no sound or movement, like one of the lifeless stubs left by fire, and Peter looked up, as his master was looking, trying to make out what it was he saw in the sky. And nothing was there, nothing that he had not seen many times before. 1,000,000,000 stars, and the moon riding king among them all, and fleecy clouds as if made of web, and stillness, a great stillness that was like sleep in the lap of the world. For a little Jolly Roger was silent, and then Peter heard him saying, "Yellow Bird was right again. She said we'd find a black world down here, and we've found it. And we're going to find Nada where she told us we'd find her, in that place she called the Country Beyond. The country beyond the forests, beyond the tall trees and the big swamps, beyond everything we've ever known of the wild and open spaces. The country where God lives in churches on Sunday, and where people would laugh at some of our queer notions, Pied-Bot. It's there we'll find Nada, driven out by the fire, and waiting for us now in the settlements." He spoke with a strange and quiet conviction, the haggard look dying out of his face as he stared up into the splendor of the sky. And then he said, "We won't sleep tonight, Peter. We'll travel with the moon." Half an hour later, as the lonely figures of man and dog headed for the first settlement a dozen miles away, there seemed to come for an instant the flash of a satisfied smile in the face of the man in the sky. End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 17 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. From the cabin, McKay went first to the great rock that jutted from the broken shoulder of Cragg's Ridge, and as they stood there, Peter heard the strange something that was like a laugh and yet was not a laugh on his master's lips. But his scraggly face did not look up. There was an answering whimper in his throat. He had been slow in sensing the significance of the mysterious thing that had changed his old home since months ago. During the hours of afternoon, and these moonlit hours that followed, he tried to understand. He knew this was home. Yet the green grass was gone, and 1,000,000 trees had changed into blackened stubs. The world was no longer shut in by deep forests. and Cragg's Ridge was naked where he and Nada had romped in sunshine and flowers, and out of it all rose the mucky death smell of the flame-swept earth. These things he understood in his dog way. But what he could not understand clearly was why Nada was not in the cabin, and why they did not find her even though the world was changed. He sat back on his haunches, and Jolly Roger heard again the whimpering grief in his throat. It comforted the man to know that Peter remembered, and he was not alone in his desolation. Gently he placed a soot-grimed hand on his comrade's head. "Peter, it was from this rock, right where we're standing now, that I first saw her a long time ago," he said, a bit of forced cheer breaking through the huskiness of his voice. "Remember the little jackpine clump down there? You climbed up onto her lap, a little know-nothing thing, and you pawed in her loose curls and growled so fiercely I could hear you. And when I made a noise and she looked up, I thought she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Just a kid, with those eyes like the flowers, and her hair shining in the sun, and tear-stains on her cheeks. Tear-stains, Pied-Bot, because of that snake who's dead over there. Remember how you growled at me, Peter?" Peter wriggled an answer. "That was the beginning," said Jolly Roger. "And this looks like the end. But—" He clenched his fists, and there was a sudden fierceness in the grotesque movement of his shadow on the rock. "We're going to find her before that end comes," he added defiantly. "We're going to find her, Pied-Bot, even if it takes us to the settlements, right up into the face of the law." He set out over the rocks, his boots making hollow sounds in the deadness of the world about them. Again he followed where once had been the trail that led to Mooney's shack, over on the wobbly line of rail that rambled for 80 miles into the wilderness from Fort William. The P.D.&W. it was named, Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western, but it had never reached Duluth, and there were those who had nicknamed it Poverty, Destruction, and Want. Many times Jolly Roger had laughed at the queer stories Nada told him about it. How a wrecking outfit was always carried behind on the twice-a-week train, and how the crew picked berries in season, and had their trapping lines, and once chased a bear halfway to Whitefish Lake while the train waited for hours. She called it the Cannon Ball, because once upon a time it had made 69 miles in 24 hours. But there was nothing of humor about it as Jolly Roger and Peter came out upon it tonight. It stretched out both ways from them, a thin, grim line of tragedy in the moonlight, and from where they stood it appeared to reach into a black and abysmal sea. Once more man and dog paused and looked back at what had been. And the whine came back in Peter's throat again, and something tugged inside him, urging him to bark up into the face of the moon, as he had often barked for Nada in the days of his puppyhood and afterward. But his master went on, and Peter followed him, stepping the uneven ties one by one. And with the black chaos of the world under and about them, and the glorious light of the moon filling the sky over their heads, the journey they made seemed weirdly unreal. For the silver and gold of the moon and the black muck of the fire refused to mingle, and while over their heads they could see the tiniest clouds and beyond to the farthest stars, all was black emptiness when they looked about them upon what once had been a living earth. Only the two lines of steel caught the moon-glow and the charred ends of the fire-shriven stubs that rose up out of the earth-shroud and silhouetted themselves against the sky. To Peter it was not what he failed to see, but what he did not hear or smell that oppressed him and stirred him to wide-eyed watchfulness against impending evil. Under many moons he had traveled with his master in their never-ending flight from the law, and many other nights with neither moon nor stars had they felt out their trails together. But always, under him and over him, on all sides of him, there had been life. And tonight there was no life, nor smell of life. There was no chirp of night bird, or flutter of owl's wing, no splash of duck or cry of loon. He listened in vain for the crinkling snap of twig and the whisper of wind in tree-tops. And there was no smell, no musk of mink that had crossed his path, no taste in the air of the strong scented fox, no subtle breath of partridge and rabbit and fleshy porcupine. And even from the far distances there came no sound, no howl of wolf, no castanet clatter of stout moose horns against bending saplings, not even the howl of a trapper's dog. The stillness was of the earth, and yet unearthly. It was even as if some fearsome thing was smothering the sound of his master's feet. To McKay, sensing these same things that Peter sensed, came understanding that brought with it an uneasiness which changed swiftly into the chill of a growing fear. The utter lifelessness told him how vast the destruction of the fire had been. Its obliteration was so great, no life had adventured back into the desolated country, though the conflagration must have passed in the preceding autumn, many months ago. The burned country was a grave, and the nearest edge of it, judged from the sepulchral stillness of the night, was many miles away. For the first time came the horror of the thought that in such a fire as this people must have died. It had swept upon them like a tidal wave, galloping the forests with the speed of a race-horse, with only this thin line of rail leading to the freedom of life outside. In places, only a miracle could have made escape possible. And here, where Nada had lived, with the pitch-wood forests crowding close, the fire must have burned most fiercely. In this moment, when fear of the unspeakable set his heart trembling, his faith fastened itself grimly to the little old gray missioner, Father John, in whose cabin Nada had taken refuge many months ago, when Jed Hawkins lay dead in the trail with his one-eyed face turned up to the thunder and lightning in the sky. Father John, on that stormy night when he fled north, had promised to care for Nada, and in silence he breathed a prayer that the missioner had saved her from the red death that had swept like an avalanche upon them. He told himself it must be so. He cried out the words aloud, and Peter heard him, and followed closer, so that his head touched his master's leg as he walked. But the fear was there. From a spark it grew into a red-hot spot in Jolly Roger's heart. Twice in his own life he had raced against death in a forest fire. But never had he seen a fire like this must have been. All at once he seemed to hear the roar of it in his ears, the rolling thunder of the earth as it twisted in the cataclysm of flame, the hissing shriek of the flaming pitch-tops as they leapt in lightning fires against the smoke-smothered sky. A few hours ago he had stood where Father John's cabin had been, and the place was a ruin of char and ash. If the fire had hemmed them in and they had not escaped— His voice cried out in sudden protest. "It can't be, Peter! It can't be! They made the rail, or the lake, and we'll find them in the settlements. It couldn't happen. God wouldn't let her die like that!" He stopped and stared into the moon-broken gloom on his left. Something was there, 50 feet away, that drew him down through the muck which lay knee-deep in the right-of-way ditch. It was what was left of the cutter's cabin, a clutter of burned logs, a wind-scattered heap of ash. Even there, within arm's reach of the railroad, there had been no salvation from the fire. He waded again through the muck of the ditch and went on. Mentally and physically he was fighting the ogre that was striving to achieve possession of his brain. Over and over he repeated his faith that Nada and the missioner had escaped and he would find them in the settlements. Less than ever he thought of the law in these hours. What happened to himself was of small importance now, if he could find Nada alive before the menace caught up with him from behind, or ambushed him ahead. Yet the necessity of caution impinged itself upon him, even in the recklessness of his determination to find her, if he had to walk into the arms of the law that was hunting him. For an hour they went on, and as the moon sank westward it seemed to turn its face to look at them. And behind them, when they looked back, the world was transformed into a black pit, while ahead, with the glow of it streaming over their shoulders, ghostly shapes took form, and vision reached farther. Twice they caught the silvery gleams of lakes through the tree stubs, and again they walked with the rippling murmur of a stream that kept for a mile within the sound of their ears. But even here, with water crying out its invitation to life, there was no life. Another hour after that, Jolly Roger's pulse beat a little faster as he strained his eyes to see ahead. Somewhere near, within a mile or two, was the first settlement with its sawmill and its bunkhouses, its one store and its few cabins, with flat mountains of sawdust on one side of it, and the evergreen forest creeping up to its doors on the other. Surely they would find life here, where there had been man-power to hold fire back from the clearing. And it was here he might find Nada and the missioner, for more than once Father John had preached to the red-cheeked women and children and the clear-eyed men of the Finnish community that thrived there. But as they drew nearer he listened in vain for the bark of a dog, and his eyes quested as futilely for a point of light in the wide canopy of gloom. At last, close together, they rounded a curve in the road, and crossed a small bridge with a creek running below, and McKay knew his arm should be able to send a stone to what he was seeking ahead. And then, a minute later, he drew in a great gasping breath of unbelief and horror. For the settlement was no longer in the clearing between him and the rim glow of the moon. No living tree raised its head against the sky. No sign of cabin or mill shadowed the earth, and where the store had been, and the little church with its white-painted cross, was only a chaos of empty gloom. He went down, as he had gone to the tie-cutter's cabin, and for many minutes he stared and listened, while Peter seemed to stand without breathing. Then, making a wide megaphone of his hands, he shouted. It was an alarming thing to do, and Peter started as if struck. For there were only ghosts to answer back, and the hollowness of a shriven pit for the cry to travel in. Nothing was there. Even the great sawdust piles had shrunk into the black scars under the scourge of the fire. A groaning agony was in the breath of Jolly Roger's lips as he went back to the railroad and hurried on. Death must have come here, death sudden and swift. And if it had fallen upon the Finnish settlement, with its strong women and its stronger men, what might it not have done in the cabin of the little old gray missioner, and Nada? For a long time after that he forgot Peter was with him. He forgot everything but his desire to reach a living thing. At times, where the road bed was smooth, he almost ran, and at others he paused for a little to gather his breath and listen. And it was Peter, in one of these intervals, who caught the first message of life. From a long distance away came faintly the barking of a dog. Half a mile farther on they came to a clearing where no stubs of trees stood up like question marks against the sky, and in this clearing was a cabin, a dark blotch that was without light or sound. But from behind it the dog barked again, and Jolly Roger made quickly toward it. Here there was no ash under his feet, and he knew that at last he had found an oasis of life in the desolation. Loudly he knocked with his fist at the cabin door, and soon there was a response inside, the heavy movement of a man's body getting out of bed, and after that the questioning voice of a woman. He knocked again, and the flare of a lighted match illumined the window. Then came the drawing of a bar at the door, and a man stood there in his night attire, a man with a heavy face and bristling beard, and a lamp in his hand. "I beg your pardon for waking you," said Jolly Roger, "but I am just down from the north, hoping to find my friends back here, and I have seen nothing but destruction and death. You are the first living soul I have found to ask about them." "Where were they?" grunted the man. "At Cragg's Ridge." "Then God help them," came the woman's voice from back in the room. "Cragg's Ridge," said the man, "was a burning hell in the middle of the night." Jolly Roger's fingers dug into the wood at the edge of the door. "You mean—" "A lot of 'em died," said the man stolidly, as if eager to rid himself of the one who had broken his sleep. "If it was Mooney, he's dead. And if it was Robson, or Jake the Swede, or the Adams family, they're dead too." "But it wasn't," said Jolly Roger, his heart choking between fear and hope. "It was Father John, the missioner, and Nada Hawkins, who lived with him, or with her foster mother in the Hawkins cabin." The man shook his head, and turned down the wick of his lamp. "I don't know about the girl, or the old witch who was her mother," he said, "but the missioner made it out safe, and went to the settlements." "And no girl was with him?" "No, there was no girl," came the woman's voice again, and Peter jerked up his ears at the creaking of a bed. "Father John stopped here the second day after the fire had passed, and he said he was gathering up the bones of the dead. Nada Hawkins wasn't with him, and he didn't say who had died and who hadn't. But I think—" She stopped, as the bearded man turned toward her. "You think what?" demanded Jolly Roger, stepping half into the room. "I think," said the woman, "that she died along with the others. Anyway, Jed Hawkins' witch woman was burned trying to make for the lake, and little of her was left." The man with the lamp made a movement as if to close the door. "That's all we know," he growled. "For God's sake, don't!" entreated Jolly Roger, barring the door with his arm. "Surely there were some who escaped from Cragg's Ridge and beyond?" "Mebbe a half, mebbe less," said the man. "I tell you it burned like hell, and the worst of it came in the middle of the night, with a wind behind it that blew a hurricane. We've 20 acres cleared here, with the cabin in the center of it, and it singed my beard and burned her hair and scorched our hands, and my pigs died out there from the heat of it. Mebbe it's a place to sleep in for the night you want, stranger?" "No, I'm going on," said Jolly Roger, the blood in his veins running with the chill of water. "How far before I come to the end of fire?" 10 miles on. It started this side of the next settlement." Jolly Roger drew back, and the door closed, and standing on the railroad once more, he saw the light go out, and after that the occasional barking of the settler's dog grew fainter and fainter behind them. He felt a great weariness in his bones and body now. With hope struck down, the exhaustion of 2 nights and a day without sleep seized upon him, and his feet plodded more and more slowly over the uneven ties of the road. Even in his weariness he thought madly against the thought that Nada was dead, and he repeated the word "impossible, impossible" so often that it ran in sing-song through his brain. And he could not keep away from him the white, thin face of the missioner who had promised on his faith in God to care for Nada, and who had passed the settler's cabin alone. Another 2 hours they went on, and then came the first of the green timber. Under the shelter of some balsams Jolly Roger found a resting place, and there they waited for the break of dawn. Peter stretched out and slept. But Jolly Roger sat with his head and shoulders against the bole of a tree, and not until the light of the moon was driven away by the darkness that preceded dawn by an hour or two did his eyes close in restless slumber. He was roused by the wakening twitter of birds, and in the cold water of a creek that ran near he bathed his face and hands. Peter wondered why there was no fire and no breakfast this morning. The settlement was only a little way ahead, and it was very early when they reached it. People were still in their beds, and out of only one chimney was smoke rising into the clear calm of the breaking day. From this cabin a young man came, and stood for a moment after he had closed the door, yawning and stretching his arms and looking up to see what sort of promise the sky held for the day. After that he went to a stable of logs, and Jolly Roger followed him there. He was unlike the bearded settler, and nodded with a youthful smile of cheer. "Good morning," he said. "You're traveling early, and—" He looked more keenly as his eyes took in Jolly Roger's boots and clothes, and the gray pallor in his face. "Just get in?" he asked kindly. "And from the burnt country?" "Yes, from the burnt country. I've been away a long time, and I'm trying to find out if my friends are among the living or the dead. Did you ever hear of Father John, the missioner at Cragg's Ridge?" The young man's face brightened. "I knew him," he said. "He helped me to bury my brother 3 years ago. And if it's him you seek, he is safe. He went up to Fort William a week after the fire, and that was in September, 8 months past." "And was there with him a girl named Nada Hawkins?" asked Jolly Roger, trying hard to speak calmly as he looked into the other's face. The youth shook his head. "No, he was alone. He slept in my cabin overnight, and he said nothing of a girl named Nada Hawkins." "Did he speak of others?" "He was very tired, and I think he was half dead with grief at what had happened. He spoke no names that I remember." Then he saw the gray look in Jolly Roger's face grow deeper, and saw the despair which could not hide itself in his eyes. "But there were a number of girls who passed here, alone or with their friends," he said hopefully. "What sort of looking girl was Nada Hawkins?" "A kid. That's what I called her," said Jolly Roger, in a dead, cold voice. 18 and beautiful, with blue eyes, and brown hair that she couldn't keep from blowing in curls about her face. So like an angel you wouldn't forget her if you'd seen her, just once." Gently the youth placed a hand on Jolly Roger's arm. "She didn't come this way," he said, "but maybe you'll find her somewhere else. Won't you have breakfast with me? I've a stranger in the cabin, still sleeping, who's going into the fire country from which you've come. He's hunting for someone, and maybe you can give him information. He's going to Cragg's Ridge." "Cragg's Ridge!" exclaimed Jolly Roger. "What is his name?" "Breault," said the youth. "Sergeant Breault, of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police." Jolly Roger turned to stroke the neck of a horse waiting for its morning feed. But he felt nothing of the touch of flesh under his hand. Cold as iron went his heart, and for half a minute he made no answer. Then he said: "Thanks, friend. I breakfasted before it was light, and I'm hitting out into the brush west and north, for the Rainy River country. Please don't tell this man Breault that you saw me, for he'll think badly of me for not wanting to give him information he might want. But you understand, if you love the brother who died, that it's hard for me to talk with anyone just now." The young man's fingers touched his arm again. "I understand," he said, "and I hope to God you'll find her." Silently they shook hands, and Jolly Roger hurried away from the cabin with the rising spiral of smoke. 3 days later a man and a dog came from the burned country into the town of Fort William, seeking for a wandering messenger of God who called himself Father John, and a young and beautiful girl whose name was Nada Hawkins. He stopped first at the old mission, in whose shadow the Indians and traders of a century before had bartered their wares, and Father Augustine, the aged patriarch who talked with him, murmured as he went that he was a strange man, and a sick one, with a little madness lurking in his eyes. And it was, in fact, a madness of despair eating out the life in Jolly Roger's heart. For he no longer had hope Nada had escaped the fire, even though at no place had he found a conclusive evidence of her death. But that signified little, for there were many of the missing who had not been found between the last of September and these days of May. What he did find, with deadly regularity, was the fact that Father John had escaped, and that he had traveled to safety alone. And Father Augustine told him that when Father John stopped to rest for a few days at the mission, he was heading north, for somewhere on Pashkokogon Lake near the river Albany. There was little rest for Peter and his master at Fort William town. That Breault must be close on their trail, and following it with the merciless determination of the ferret from which he had been named, there was no shadow of doubt in the mind of Jolly Roger McKay. So after outfitting his pack at a little corner shop, where Breault would be slow to inquire about him, he struck north through the bush toward Dog Lake and the river of the same name. 5 or 6 days, he thought, would bring him to Father John and the truth which he dreaded more and more to hear. The despondency of his master had sunk, in some mysterious way, into the soul of Peter. Without the understanding of language, he sensed the oppressive gloom of tragedy behind and about him, and there was a wolfish slinking in the manner of his travel now, and his confidence was going as he caught the disease of despair of the man who traveled with him. But constantly and vigilantly his eyes and scent were questing about them, suspicious of the very winds that whispered in the tree-tops. And at night, after they had built their little cooking fire in the deepest heart of the bush, he would lie half awake during the hours of darkness, the watchfulness of his senses never completely dulled in the stupor of sleep. Since the night they had stopped at the settler's cabin, Jolly Roger's face had grown grayer and thinner. A number of times he had tried to assure himself what he would do in that moment which was coming, when he would stand face to face with Breault the man-hunter. His caution, after he left Fort William, was in a way an automatic instinct that worked for self-preservation in face of the fact that he was growing less and less concerned regarding Breault's appearance. It was not in his desire to delay the end much longer. The chase had been a long one, with its thrills and its happiness at times, but now he was growing tired, and with Nada gone there was only hopeless gloom ahead. If she were dead, he wanted to go to her. That thought was a dawning pleasure in his breast, and it was warm in his heart when he tied in a hard knot the buckskin string which locked the flap of his pistol holster. When Breault overtook him, the law would know, because of the significance of this knot, that he had welcomed the end of the game. Never in the Northland had there come a spring more beautiful than this of the year in which McKay and his dog went through the deep wilds to Pashkokogon Lake. In a few hours, it seemed, the last chill died out of the air, and there came the soft whispers of those bridal weeks between May and summer, a month ahead of their time. But Jolly Roger, for the first time in his life, failed to respond to the wonder and beauty of the earth's rejoicing. The first flowers did not fill him with the old joy. He no longer stood up straight, with expanding chest, to drink in the rare sweetness of air weighted with the tonic of balsams and cedar spruce. Vainly he tried to lift up his soul with the song and bustle of mating things. There was no longer music for him in the flood-time rushing of spring waters. An utter loneliness filled the cry of the loon, and all about him was a vast emptiness from which the spirit of life had fled for him. Thus he came at last to a stream in the Burntwood country, which ran into Pashkokogon Lake, and it was this day, in the mellow sunlight of late afternoon, that they heard coming to them from out of the dense forest the chopping of an axe. Toward this they made their way, with caution and no sound, until in a little clearing in a bend of the stream they saw a cabin. It was a newly built cabin, and smoke was rising from the chimney. But the chopping was nearer them, in the heart of a thick cover of evergreen and birch. Into this Jolly Roger and Peter made their way, and came within a dozen steps of the man who was wielding the axe. It was then that Jolly Roger rose up with a cry on his lips, for the man was Father John the missioner. In spite of the tragedy through which he had passed, the little gray man seemed younger than in that month long ago when Jolly Roger had fled to the north. He dropped his axe now, and stood as if only half believing, a look of joy shining in his face as he realized the truth of what had happened. "McKay!" he cried, reaching out his hands. "McKay, my boy!" A look of pity mellowed the gladness in his eyes as he noted the change in Jolly Roger's face, and the despair that had set its mark upon it. They stood for a moment with clasped hands, questioning and answering with the silence of their eyes. And then the missioner said, "You have heard? Someone has told you?" "No," said Jolly Roger, his head dropping a little. "No one has told me." And he was thinking of Nada and her death. Father John's fingers tightened. "It is strange how the ways of God bring themselves about," he spoke in a low voice. "Roger, you did not kill Jed Hawkins." Dumbly, his lips dried of words, Jolly Roger stared at him. "No, you didn't kill him," repeated Father John. "On that same night of the storm when you thought you left him dead in the trail, he stumbled back to his cabin, alive. But God's vengeance came soon. A few days later, while drunk, he missed his footing and fell from a ledge to his death. His wife, poor creature, wished him buried in sight of the cabin door." But in this moment Roger McKay was thinking less of Breault the ferret and the loosening of the hangman's rope from about his neck than he was of another thing. And Father John was saying in a voice that seemed far away and unreal, "We've sent out word to all parts of the north, hoping someone would find you and send you back. And she has prayed each night, and each hour of the day the same prayer has been in her heart and on her lips. And now—" Someone was coming to them from the direction of the cabin. Someone, a girl, and she was singing. McKay's face went whiter than the gray ash of fire. "My God," he whispered huskily. "I thought she had died." It was only then Father John understood the meaning of what he had seen in his face. "No, she is alive," he cried. "I sent her straight north through the bush with an Indian the day after the fire. And later I left word for you with the Fire Relief Committee at Fort William, where I thought you would first inquire." "And it was there," said Jolly Roger, "that I did not inquire at all." In the edge of the clearing, close to the thickest of timber, Nada had stopped. For across the open space a strange-looking creature had raced at the sound of her voice, a dog with bristling Airedale whiskers and a hound's legs, and wild wolf's body hardened and roughened by months of fighting in the wilderness. As in the days of his puppyhood, Peter leaped up against her, and a cry burst from Nada's lips, a wild and sobbing cry of "Peter! Peter! Peter!" And it was this cry Jolly Roger heard as he tore away from Father John. On her knees, with her arms about Peter's shaggy head, Nada stared wildly at the clump of timber, and in a moment she saw a man break out of it, and stand still, as if the mellow sunlight blinded him and made him unable to move. And the same choking weakness was at her own heart as she rose up from Peter and reached out her arms toward the gray figure in the edge of the wood, sobbing, trying to speak, and yet saying no word. And a little slower, because of his age, Father John came a moment later, and peered out with the knowledge of long years from a thicket of young banksians, and when he saw the two in the open, close in each other's arms, and Peter hopping madly about them, he drew out a handkerchief and wiped his eyes, and went back then for the axe which he had dropped in the timber clump. There was a great drumming in Jolly Roger's head, and for a time he failed even to hear Peter yelping at their side, for all the world was drowned in those moments by the breaking sobs in Nada's breath and the wild thrill of her body in his arms, and he saw nothing but the upturned face, crushed close against his breast, and the wide open eyes, and the lips to kiss. And even Nada's face he seemed to see through a silvery mist, and he felt her arms strangely about his neck, as if it was all half like a dream of the kind that had come to him beside his campfire. It was a little cry from Nada that drove the unreality away. "Roger, you're breaking me!" she cried, gasping for her breath in his arms, yet without giving up the clasp of her own arms about his neck in the least. And at that he sensed the brutality of his strength, and held her off a little, looking into her face. Pride and happiness and the courage in his heart would have slunk away could he have seen himself then, as Father John saw him, coming from the edge of the bush, and as Nada saw him, held there at the end of his arms. Since the day he had come with Peter to Cragg's Ridge, the blade of a razor had not touched his face, and his beard was like a brush, and with it his hair unkempt and straggling, and his eyes were red from sleeplessness and the haunting of that grim despair which had dogged his footsteps. But these things Nada did not see, or if she did, there must have been something beautiful about them for her. For it was not a little girl, but a woman who was standing there before Jolly Roger now, Nada grown older, very much older it seemed to McKay, and taller, with her hair no longer rioting free about her, but gathered up in a wonderful way on the crown of her head. This change McKay discovered as she stood there, and it swept upon him all in a moment, and with it the prick of something swift and terrorizing inside him. She was not the little girl of Cragg's Ridge. She was a woman. In a year had come this miracle of change, and it frightened him, for such a creature as this that stood before him now, Jed Hawkins would never have dared to curse or beat, and he, Roger McKay, was afraid to gather her back into his arms again. And then, even as his fingers slowly drew themselves away from her shoulders, he saw that which had not changed, the wonder light in her eyes, the soul that lay as open to him now as on that other day in Indian Tom's cabin, when Mrs. Captain Kidd had bustled and squeaked in the pantry shelf, and Peter had watched them as he lay with his broken leg in the going down of the sun. And as he hesitated, it was Nada herself who came into his arms, and laid her head on his breast, and trembled and laughed and cried there, while Father John came up and patted her shoulder, and smiled happily at McKay, and then went on to the cabin in the clearing. For a time after that, Jolly Roger crushed his face in Nada's hair, and neither said a word, but there was a strange throbbing of their hearts together, and after a little Nada reached up a hand to his cheek and stroked it tenderly, bristly beard and all. "I'll never let you run away from me again, Mr. Jolly Roger," she said, and it was the little Nada of Cragg's Ridge who whispered the words, half sobbing. But in the voice there was also something very definite and very sure, and McKay felt the glorious thrill of it as he raised his face from her hair and saw once more the sun-filled world about him. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 18 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. Following this day, Peter was observant of a strange excitement in the cabin on the Burntwood. It was not so much a thing of physical happening, but more the mysterious feel of something impending and very near. The day following their arrival in the Pashkokogon country, his master seemed to have forgotten him entirely. It was Nada who noticed him, but even she was different, and Father John went about, overseeing 2 Indians whom he kept very busy, his pale, thin face luminous with an anticipation which roused Peter's curiosity and kept him watchful. He was puzzled, too, by the odd actions of the humans about him. The second morning Nada remained in her room, and Jolly Roger wandered off into the woods without his breakfast, and Father John ate alone, smiling gently as he looked at the tightly closed door of Nada's bedroom. Even Oosimisk, the Leaf Bud, the sleek-haired Indian woman who cared for the house, was nervously expectant as she watched for Nada, and Mistus, her husband, grunted and grimaced as he carried in from the edge of the forest many loads of soft evergreens on his shoulders. Into the forest Jolly Roger went alone, puffing furiously at his pipe. He was all a-tremble and his blood seemed to quiver and dance as it ran through his veins. Since the first rose-flush of dawn he had been awake, fighting against this upsetting of every nerve that was in him. He felt pitiably weak and helpless, but it was the weakness and helplessness of a happiness too vast for him to measure. It was Nada in her ragged shoes and dress, with the haunting torture of Jed Hawkins' brutality in her eyes and face, that he had expected to find, if he found her at all, someone to fight for, and kill for if necessary, someone his muscle and brawn would always protect against evil. He had not dreamed that in these many months with Father John she would change from a little kid going on 18 into a woman. He tried to recall just what he had said to her last night, that he was still an outlaw and would always be, no matter how well he lived from this day on, and that she, now that she had Father John's protection, was very foolish to care for him, or keep her troth with him, and would be happier if she could forget what had happened to Cragg's Ridge. "You're a woman now," he said. "A woman," he had emphasized that, "and you don't need me any more." And she had looked at him, without speaking, as if reading what was inside him, and then with a sudden little laugh she swiftly pulled her hair down about her shoulders, and repeated the very words she had said to him a long time ago. "Without you, I'd want to die, Mr. Jolly Roger." And with that she turned and ran into the cabin, her hair flying riotously, and he had not seen her again since that moment. Since then his heart had behaved like a thing with a fever, and it was beating swiftly now as he looked at his watch and noted the quick passing of time. Back in the cabin Peter was sniffing at the crack under Nada's door and listening to her movement. For a long time he had heard her, but not once had she opened the door. And he wondered, after that, why Oosimisk and her husband and Father John piled evergreens all about, until the cabin looked like the little jackpine trysting place down at Cragg's Ridge, even to the soft carpet of grass on the floor, and flowers scattered all about. Hopeless of understanding what it meant, he went outside, and waited in the warm May-day sun until his master came back through the clearing. What happened after that puzzled him greatly. When he followed Jolly Roger into the cabin, Mistus and the Leaf Bud were seated in chairs, their hands folded, and Father John stood behind a small table on which lay an open book, and he was looking at his watch when they came in. He nodded and smiled, and very clearly Peter saw his master gulp, as if swallowing something that was in his throat, and the ruddiness had gone completely out of his smooth-shaven cheeks. It was the first time Peter had seen his master so clearly afraid, and from his burrow in the evergreens he growled under his breath, eyeing the open door with sudden thought of an enemy. And then Father John was tapping at Nada's door. He went back to the table and waited, and as the knob of the door turned very slowly, Jolly Roger swallowed again and took a step toward it. It opened and Nada stood there, and Jolly Roger gave a little cry, so low that Peter could just hear it, as he held out his hands to her. For Nada was no longer the Nada who had come to him in Father John's clearing. She was the Nada of Cragg's Ridge, the Nada of that wild night of storm when he had fled into the north. Her hair fell about her, as in the old days when Peter and she had played together among the rocks and flowers, and her wedding dress was faded and torn, for it was the dress she had worn that night of despair when she sent her message to Peter's master, and on her little feet were shoes broken and disfigured by her flight in those last hours of her mighty effort to go with the man she loved. In Father John's eyes, as she stood there, was a great astonishment, but in Jolly Roger's there came such a joy that, in answer to it, Nada went straight into his arms and held up her lips to be kissed. Her cheeks were very pink when she stood beside McKay, with Father John before them, the open book in his hands. And then, as her long lashes drooped over her eyes, and her breath came a little more quickly, she saw Peter staring at her questioningly, and made a little motion to him with her hand. He went to her, and her fingers touched his head as Father John began speaking. Peter looked up and listened, and was very quiet in these moments. Jolly Roger was staring straight at the balsam-decked wall opposite him, but there was something mighty strong and proud in the way he held his head, and the fear had gone completely out of his eyes. And Nada stood very close to him, so that her brown head lightly touched his shoulder, and he could see the silken shimmer of loose tresses with sweet intent she had let fall over his arm. And her little fingers clung tightly to his thumb, as on that blessed night when they had walked together across the plain below Cragg's Ridge, with the moon lighting their way. Peter, in his dog way, fell a-wondering as he stood there, but kept his manners and remained still. When it was all over, he felt a desire to show his teeth and growl, for when Father John had kissed Nada, and was shaking Jolly Roger's hand, he saw his mistress crying in that strange, silent way he had so often seen her crying in his puppyhood days. Only now her blue eyes were wide open as she looked at Jolly Roger, and her cheeks were flushed to the pink of wild rose petals, and her lips were trembling a little, and there was a tiny something pulsing in her soft white throat. And all at once there came a smile with the tears, and Jolly Roger, turning from Father John to find her thus, gathered her close in his arms, and Peter wagged his tail and went out into the sun-filled day, where he heard a red squirrel challenging him from a stub in the edge of the clearing. A little later he saw Nada and his master come out of the cabin, and walk hand in hand across the open into the sweet-smelling timber where Father John had been chopping with his axe. On a fresh-cut log Nada sat down, and McKay sat beside her, still holding her hand. Not once had he spoken in crossing the open, and it seemed as though little devils were holding his lips closed now. With her eyes looking down at the greening earth under their feet, Nada said very softly, "Mr. Jolly Roger, are you glad?" "Yes," he said. "Glad that I am your wife?" The word drew a great sobbing breath from him, and looking up suddenly she saw that he was staring over the balsam tops into the wonderful blue of the sky. "Your wife," she whispered, touching his shoulder gently with her lips. "Yes, I'm glad," he said. "So glad that I'm afraid." "Then if you are glad, please kiss me again." He stood up and drew her to him, and held her face between his hands as he kissed her red lips. And after that he kissed her shining hair again and again, and when he let her go, her eyes were a glory of happiness. "And you will never run away from me again?" she demanded, holding him at arm's length. "Never?" "Never." "Then I want nothing more in this life," she said, nestling against him again. "Only you, forever and ever." Jolly Roger made no answer, but held her a long time in his arms, with the soft beating of her heart against him, and listening to the twitter and song of nesting and mating things about them. In this silence she lay content, until Peter, growing restless, started quietly into the golden depths of the forest. It was Pied-Bot's going, cautious and soft-footed, as if danger and menace might lurk just ahead of him, that brought another look into McKay's eyes as Nada's hand crept to his cheek and rested there. "You love me very much?" "More than life," he answered, and as he spoke he was watching Peter questing the soft wind that came whispering from the south. Her finger touched his lips, gentle and sweet. "And wherever you go, I go, forever and always?" she questioned. "Yes, forever and always," and his eyes were looking through miles upon miles of deep forest, and at the end he saw the thin and pitiless face of a man who was following his trail. Breault, the ferret. His arms closed more tightly about her, and he pressed her face against him. "And I pray God you will never be sorry," he said, still looking through the miles of forest. "No, no, sorry I shall never be," she cried softly. "Not if we fly and go hungry and fight and die. Never shall I be sorry with you." And he felt the tightening of her arms. And then, as he remained silent, with his lips on the velvety smoothness of her hair, she told him what Father John had already told him, of her wild effort to overtake him in that night of storm when he had fled from the missioner's cabin at Cragg's Ridge, and in turn he told her how Peter came to him in the break of the morning with the treasure which had saved him heart and soul, and how he had given that treasure into the keeping of Yellow Bird on the shores of Wollaston. And thereafter, for an hour, as they wandered through the Maytime sweetness of the forest, she would permit him to talk of only Yellow Bird and Sun Cloud, and one thing leading to another, she learned how it was that Yellow Bird had been his fairy in childhood days, and how he came to be an outlaw for her in later manhood. Her eyes were shining when he had finished, and her red lips were a-tremble with the quickness of her breathing. "Some day you'll take me there," she whispered. "Oh, I'm so proud of you, my Roger. And I love Yellow Bird and Sun Cloud. Some day we'll go." He nodded, happiness overshadowing the fear of Breault that had grown in his heart. "Yes, we'll go. I've dreamed it, and the dream helped to keep me alive." And then he told her of Cassidy, and of the paradise he had found with Giselle and her grandfather on the other side of Wollaston. And so it happened the hours passed swiftly, and it was afternoon when they returned to Father John's cabin, and Nada went into her room. In the early waning of the sun, the feast which the Leaf Bud had been preparing was ready, and not until then did Nada appear again. And once more the lump rose in Roger's throat at the wonder of her, for very completely she had transformed herself into a woman again, from the softly shining coils of hair on the crown of her head to the coquettish little slippers that set off her dainty feet. And he saw the white gleam of soft shoulders and tender arms where once had been rags and bruises, and held there by the slim beauty and exquisite daintiness of her, he stared like a fool, until suddenly she laughed joyously at his amaze, and ran to him with wide open arms, and kissed him so soundly that Peter cocked up his ears a bit startled. And then she kissed Father John, and after that was mistress at the table, radiant in her triumph and her eyes starry with happiness. And she was no longer shy in speaking his name, but called him Roger boldly and many times, and twice during that meal of marvelous forgetfulness, though long lashes covered her eyes when she spoke it, she called him my husband. In truth, she was a woman, and for the most part Roger McKay, fighting man and very strong though he was, looked at her in dumb worship, speaking little, his heart athrob, and his brain reeling in the marvel of what at last had come into his possession. And yet, even in this hour of supreme happiness that held him half mute, There was always lurking in the back of his brain a thought of Breault, the ferret. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 19 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. In the star dusk of evening the time came when he spoke his fears to Father John. Nada had gone into her room, taking Peter with her, and out under the cool of the skies Father John's pale face was turned up to the unending glory of the firmament, and his lips were whispering a prayer of gratitude and blessing, when Roger laid a hand gently on his arm. "Father," he said, "it is a wonderful night." "A night of gladness and omen," replied Father John. "See the stars. They seem to be alive and rejoicing, and it is not sacrilege to believe they are giving you their benediction." "And yet I am afraid." "Afraid?" Father John looked into his eyes and saw him staring off over the forest tops. "Yes, afraid for her." Briefly he told him of what had happened on the Barren months ago, and how he had narrowly escaped Breault in coming away from the burned country. "He is on my trail," he said, "and tonight he is not very far away." The missioner's hand rested in a comforting way on his arm. "You did not kill Jed Hawkins, my son, and for that we have thanked God each day and night of our lives, Nada and I. And each evening she has prayed for you, kneeling at my side, and through every hour of the day I know she was praying for you in her heart, and I believe in the answer to prayer such as that, Roger. Her faith, now, is as deep as the sea. And you, too, must have faith." "She is more precious to me than life, 1,000 lives if I had them," whispered Jolly Roger. "If anything should happen now—" "Yes, if the thing you fear should happen, what then?" cried Father John, faith ringing like a note of inspiration in his low voice. "What then, Roger? You did not kill Jed Hawkins. If the law compels you to pay a price for the errors it believes you have committed, will that price be so terribly severe?" "Prison, Father. Probably 5 years." Father John laughed softly, the star-glow revealing a radiance in his face. "5 years," he repeated. "Oh, my boy, my dear boy! What are 5 years to pay for such a treasure as that which has come into your possession tonight? 5 short years. Only 5. And she waiting for you, proud of you for those very achievements which sent you to prison, planning for all the future that lies beyond those 5 short years, growing sweeter and more beautiful for you as she waits. Roger, is that a very great sacrifice? Is it too great a price to pay? 5 years, and after that, peace, love, happiness for all time? Is it, Roger?" McKay felt his voice tremble as he tried to answer. "But she, Father—" "Yes, yes, I know what you would say," interrupted Father John gently. "I argued with her, just as you would have argued, Roger. I appealed to her reason. I told her that if you returned it would mean prison for you, and strangely I said that same thing, 5 years. But I found her selfish, Roger, very selfish, and set upon her desire beyond all reason. And it was she who asked first those very questions I have asked you tonight. 'What are 5 years?' she demanded of me, defying my logic. 'What are 5 years, or 10, or 20, if I know I am to have him after that?' Yes, she was selfish, Roger. Just that great is her love for you." "Dear God in heaven!" breathed Jolly Roger, and stopped, his eyes staring wide at the stars. And after that, after I had given in to her selfishness, Roger, she planned how we, she and I, would live very near to the place where they imprisoned you, and how each day some sight or sign should pass between you and the baby. The baby, Father? Thus it seems she dreams, Roger. She, in the wilfulness of her desire and selfishness. With a choking cry, Roger bowed his face in his hands. For a moment Father John was silent. And then he said, so very low that it was almost a whisper, "I have passed many years in the wilderness, Roger, many years trying to look into the hearts of people, and of God. And this love of Nada's, is the greatest of all the miracles I have witnessed in a life that is now reaching to its 65. Do you see the wonder of it, son? And does it make you happy and fearless now?" He did not wait for an answer, but turned slowly and went in the direction of the cabin, leaving Roger alone under the thickening stars. And McKay's face was like Father John's, filled with a strange and wonderful radiance when he looked up. But with that light of happiness was also the fiercer underglow of a great determination. For Nada, for the baby, the worst should not happen. He breathed the thought aloud, and in the words was a prayer that God might help him, and make unnecessary the sacrifice from which Father John had taken the sting of fear. And yet, if that sacrifice came, he saw clearly now that it would not be a great tragedy, but only a brief shadow cast over the undying happiness in his soul. For they, Nada and the baby, would be waiting. Suddenly he was conscious of a sound very near, and he beheld Nada, taller and slimmer and more beautiful than ever, it seemed to him, in the starlight. "I have told him," Father John had whispered to her only a moment before. "I have told him, so that he will not fear prison, either for himself or for you." And she had come to him quietly, all of the pretty triumph and playfulness gone, so that she stood like an angel in the soft glow of the skies, much older than he had ever seen her before, and smiled at him with a new and wonderful tenderness as she held out her hands to him. Not until she lay in his arms, looking up at him from under her long lashes, did he dare to speak. And then, "Is it true, what Father John has told me?" he asked. "It is true," she whispered, and the silken lashes covered her eyes. Her hand crept up to his face in the silence that followed, and rested there. And with no desire to hear more than the 3 words she had spoken, he crushed his lips in the sweet coils of her hair, and together, in that peace and understanding, they listened to the gentle whisperings of the night. "Roger," she whispered at last. "Yes, my Newa." "What does that mean, Roger?" "It means beloved, wife." "Then I like it. But I shall like the others, one of the others, best." "My wife." That makes me happiest, Roger. Your wife. Oh, it is the sweetest word in the world. That and—" He felt her warm face hide itself softly against his neck. "Mother," he added. "Yes, mother," she repeated after him in an awed little voice. "Oh, I have dreamed of mothers since I have been old enough to dream, Roger. My mother. I never had one that I can remember, except in a dream. It must be wonderful to have a mother, Roger." "And yet, I think not quite so wonderful as to be a mother, my Nada." "Listen," she whispered. "It is the Leaf Bud singing." "A love song?" "Yes, in Cree." She raised her head so that her eyes were wide open and looking at him. "Since we came up here all this wonderful world has been promising song for me, Roger. And since you came back to me it has been singing, singing, singing every hour of night and day. Have you ever dreamed of leaving it, Roger? Of going down into that world of towns and cities of which Father John has told me so much? Would you like to go there, Nada? Only to look upon it and come away. I want to live in the forests where I found you. Always and always, Roger." She raised herself on tiptoe and kissed him. "I want to live near Yellow Bird and Sun Cloud. Please, Mr. Jolly Roger, I do. And Father John will go with us. And we'll be so happy there all together, Yellow Bird and Sun Cloud and Giselle and I. Oh!" His arms had tightened so suddenly that the little cry came from her. "And yet I may have to leave you for a little time, Nada. But it will not be for long. What are 5 years, when all life reaches out a paradise before us? They are nothing, nothing, and will pass swiftly. Yes, they will pass swiftly," she said, so gently that scarce did he hear. But on his breast she gave a little sob which could not choke itself back, a sob which bravely she smiled through a moment later, and which he, knowing that it was best, made as if he had not heard. And so this night, while Father John and Peter waited and watched in the cabin, did they plan their future in the company of the stars. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 20 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. The Sabbath was a day of glory and peace in the Burntwood country. The sun rose warm and golden, the birds were singing, and never had the air seemed sweeter to Father John when he came out quietly from the cabin and breathed it in the early break of dawn. Best of all, he loved this very beginning of day, before darkness was quite gone, when the world seemed to be awakening mid sleepy whisperings, and sounds came clearly from a long distance. This morning he heard the barking of a dog, a mile away it must have been, and Peter, who followed close behind him, pricked up his ears at the sound of it. Father John had noted Peter's vigilance, the cautious expectancy with which he was always sniffing the air, and the keen alertness of his eyes and ears. McKay had explained the reason for it. And this morning, as they made their way down to the pool at the creekside, Peter's ceaseless watching for danger held a deeper significance for Father John. All through the night, in spite of his faith and his words of consolation, he was thinking of the menace which was following McKay, and which eventually must catch up with him. And yet, how short a time was 5 years! Looking backward, each 5 years of his life seemed but a yesterday. It was 8 times 5 years ago that a sweet-faced girl had first filled his life, as Nada filled Jolly Roger's now, and through the 30 years since he had lost her, he could still hear her voice as clearly as though he had held her in his arms only a few hours ago, so swift had been the passing of time. But looking ahead, and not backward, 5 years seemed an eternity of time, and the dread of it was in Father John's heart as he stood at the side of the pool, with the first pink glow of sunrise coming to him over the forest tops. 5 years, and he was an old man now. A long and dreary wait it would be for him. But for youth, the glorious youth of Roger and Nada, it would seem very short when in later years they looked back upon it. And for a time, as he contemplated the long span of life that lay behind him, and the briefness of that which lay ahead, a yearning selfishness possessed the soul of Father John, an almost savage desire to hold those 5 years away from the violation of the law, not alone for Nada's sake and Roger McKay's, but for his own. In this twilight of a tragic life, a great happiness had come to him in the love of these two, and thought of its menace, its desecration by a pitiless and mistaken justice, roused in him something that was more like the soul of a fighting man than the spirit of a missioner of God. Vainly he tried to stamp out the evil of this resentment, for evil he believed it to be. And shame possessed him when he saw the sweet glory in Nada's face later that morning, and the happiness that was in Roger McKay's. Yet was that aching place in his heart, and the hidden fear which he could not vanquish. And that day, it seemed to him, his lips gave voice to lies. For being Sunday, the wilderness folk gathered from miles about, and he preached to them in the little mission house which they had helped him to build of logs in the clearing. Partly he spoke in Cree, and partly in English, and his message was one of hope and inspiration, pointing out the silver linings that always lay beyond the darkness of clouds. To McKay, holding Nada's hand in his own as they listened, Father John's words brought a great and comforting faith. And in Nada's eyes and voice, as she led in Cree the song, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," he heard and saw the living fire of that faith, and had Breault come in through the open doorway then, he would have accepted him calmly as the beginning of that sacrifice which he had made up his mind to make. In the afternoon, when the wilderness people had gone, Father John heard again the story of Yellow Bird, for Nada was ever full of questions about her, and for the first time the missioner learned of the inspiration which the Indian woman's sorcery had been to Jolly Roger. "It was foolish," McKay apologized, in spite of the certainty and faith which he was shining in Nada's eyes. "But it helped me." "It wasn't foolish," replied Nada quickly. "Yellow Bird did come to me. And she knew." "No true faith is folly," said Father John, in his soft, low voice. "The great fact is that Yellow Bird believed. She was inspired by a great confidence, and confidence and faith give to the mind a power which it is utterly incapable of possessing without them. I believe in the mind, children. I believe that in some day to come it will reach those heights where it will unlock the mystery of life itself to us. I have seen many strange things in my 40-odd years in the wilderness, and not the least of these have been the achievements of the primitive mind, and it seems to me, Roger, that Yellow Bird told you much that has come true. And has it occurred to you—" He stopped, knowing that the cloud of unrest which was almost fear in his heart was driving him to say these things. "What, Father?" questioned Nada, bending toward him. "I was about to express a thought which suggests an almost childish curiosity, and you will laugh at me, my dear. I am wondering if it has occurred to Roger the mysterious 'country beyond' of which Yellow Bird dreamed might be the great country down there, south, beyond the border. The United States?" Something which he could not control seemed to drive the words from his lips, and in an instant he saw that Nada had seized upon their significance. Her eyes widened. The blue in them grew darker, and Roger observed her fingers grip suddenly in the softness of her dress as she turned from Father John to look at him. "Or it might be China, or Africa, or the South Seas," he tried to laugh, remembering his old visions. "It might be anywhere." Nada's lips trembled as if she were about to speak, and then very quietly she sat, with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, and Father John knew she was not expressing the thought in her heart when she said, "Some day I want to tell Yellow Bird how much I love her." Now in these hours since he and his master had come to the Burntwood, it seemed to Peter that he had lost something very great, for in his happiness McKay had taken but scant notice of him, and Nada seemed to have found a greater joy than that which a long time ago she had found in his comradeship. So now, as she saw him lying in his loneliness a short distance away, Nada suddenly ran to him, and together they went into the thick screen of the balsams, Peter yipping joyously, and Nada without so much as turning her head in the direction of Roger and Father John. But even in that bird-like swiftness with which she had left them, Father John had caught the look in her eyes. "I have made a mistake," he confessed humbly. "I have sinned, because in her I have roused the temptation to urge you to fly away with her, down there, south. She is a woman, and being a woman she has infinite faith in Yellow Bird, for Yellow Bird helped to give you to her. She believes—" "And I also believe," said McKay, staring at the green balsams. "And yet it is better for you to remain. God means that judgment and happiness should come in their turn." Jolly Roger rose to his feet, facing the south. "It is a temptation, Father. It would be hard to give her up, now. If Breault would only wait a little while. But if he comes now—" He walked away slowly, following through the balsams where Nada and Peter had gone. Father John watched him go, and a trembling smile came to his lips when he was alone. In his heart he knew he was a coward, and that these young people had been stronger than he. For in their happiness and the faith which he had falsely built up in them they had resigned themselves to the inevitable, while he, in these moments of cowardice, had shown them the way to temptation. And yet as he stood there, looking in the direction they had gone, he felt no remorse because of what he had done, and a weight seemed to have lifted itself from his shoulders. For a time the more selfish instincts of the man rose in him, fighting down the sacrificial humility of the great faith of which he was a messenger. The new sensation thrilled him, and in its thrill he felt his heart beating a little faster, and hope rising in him. 5 years were a long time for him. That was the thought which kept repeating itself over and over in his brain, and with it came that other thought, that self-preservation was the first law of existence, and therefore could not be a sin. Thus did Father John turn traitor to his spoken words, though his calm and smiling face gave no betrayal of it when Nada and Roger returned to the cabin an hour later, their arms filled with red bakneesh vines and early wildflowers. Nada's cheeks were as pink as the bakneesh, and her eyes as blue as the rock violets she wore on her breast. And Father John knew that Jolly Roger was no longer oppressed by the fear of a menace which he was helpless to oppose, for there was something very confident in the look of his eyes and the manner in which they rested upon Nada. Peter alone saw the mysterious thing which happened in the early evening. He was with Nada in her room, and she was the old Nada again, hugging his shaggy head in her arms, and whispering to him in the old excited way. And strange memory of a bundle came back to Peter, for very quietly, as if unseen ears might be listening to her, Nada gathered many things in a pile on the table, and made another bundle. This bundle she thrust under her bed, just as a long time ago she had thrust a similar bundle under a banksian clump in the meadowland below Cragg's Ridge. Father John went to his bed very early, and he was thinking of Breault. The Hudson's Bay Company post was only 12 miles away, and Breault would surely go there before questing from cabin to cabin for his victim. So it happened that a little after midnight he rose without making a sound, and by the light of a candle wrote a note for Nada, saying he had business at the post that day, and without wakening them had made an early start. This note Nada read to McKay when they sat at breakfast. "Quite frequently he has gone like that," Nada explained. "He loves the forests at night, in the light of the moon." "But last night there was no moon," said Roger. "Yes." "And when Father John left the cabin the sky was clouded, and it was very dark." "You heard him go?" "Yes, and saw him. There was a worried look in his face when he wrote that note in the candle glow." "Roger, what do you mean?" McKay went behind her chair and tilted up her face, and kissed her shining hair and questioning eyes. "It means, precious little wife, that Father John is hurrying to the post to get news of Breault if he can. It means that deep in his heart he wants us to follow Yellow Bird's advice to the end. For he is sure that he knows what Yellow Bird meant by the country beyond. It is the great big world outside the forests. A world so big that if need be we can put ourselves 10,000 miles away from the trails of the mounted police. That is the thought which is urging him to the post to look for Breault. Her arms crept up to his neck, and in a little voice trembling with eagerness she said, "Roger, my bundle is ready. I prepared it last night, and it is under the bed." He held her more closely. "Are you willing to go with me anywhere?" "Yes, anywhere." "To the end of the earth?" Her crumpled head nodded against his breast. "And leave Father John?" "Yes, for you. But I think sometime he will come to us." Her fingers touched his cheek. "And there must be forests, big, beautiful forests, in some other part of the world, Roger." "Or a desert, where they would never think of looking for us," he laughed happily. "I'd love the desert, Roger." "Or an uninhabited island?" Against him her head nodded again. "I'd love life anywhere, with you." "Then we'll go," he said, trying to speak very calmly in spite of the joy that was consuming him like a fire. And then he went on, steadying his voice until it was almost cold. "But it means giving up everything you've dreamed of, Nada, these forests you love, Father John, Yellow Bird, Sun Cloud." "I have only one dream," she interrupted him softly. "And 5 years will pass very quickly," he continued. "Possibly it will not be as bad as that, and afterward all this land we love will be free to us forever. Gladly will I remain and take my punishment if, in the end, it will make us happier, Nada." "I have only one dream," she repeated, caressing his cheek with her hand. "And that is you, Roger. Wherever you take me I shall be the happiest woman in the world." "Woman," he laughed, scarcely breathing the word aloud. "Yes, I am a woman now." "And yet forever and ever the little girl of Cragg's Ridge," he cried with sudden passion, crushing her close to him. "I'd lose my life sooner than I would lose her, Nada, the little girl with flying hair and strawberry stain on her nose, and who believed so faithfully in the man in the moon. Always I shall worship her as the little goddess who came down to me from somewhere in heaven." Yet all through that day, as they waited for Father John's return, he saw more and more of the wonder of woman that had come to crown the glory of Nada's wifehood, and his heart trembled with joy at the miracle of it. There was something vastly sweet in the change of her. She was no longer the utterly dependent little thing, possibly caring for him because he was big and strong and able to protect her. She was a woman, and loved him as a woman, and not because of fear or helplessness. And then came the thrilling mystery of another thing. He found himself, in turn, beginning to depend upon her, and in their planning, her calm decision and quiet reasoning strengthened him with new confidence and made his heart sing with gladness. With his eyes on the smooth and velvety coils of hair which she had twisted woman-like on her head, he said, "With your hair like that you are my Margaret of Anjou, and the other way, with it down, you are my little Nada of Cragg's Ridge. And I don't quite understand why God should be so good to me." And this day Peter was trying in his dumb way to analyze the change. The touch of Nada's hand thrilled him, as it did a long time ago, and still he sensed the difference. Her voice was even softer when she put her cheek down to his whiskered face and talked to him, but in it he missed that which he could not quite bring back clearly through the lapse of time, the childish comradeship of her. yet he began to worship her anew, even more fiercely than he had loved the Nada of old. He was content now to lie with his nose touching her foot or dress, but when in the sunset of early evening she went into her room, and came out a little later with her curling hair clouding her shoulders and breast, and tied with a faded ribbon she had brought from Cragg's Ridge, he danced about her, yelping joyously, and she accepted the challenge in a wild race with him to the edge of the clearing. Panting and flushed, she ran back to Jolly Roger and rested in his arms. And it was McKay, with his face half hidden in her riotous hair, who saw a figure come suddenly out of the forest at the far end of the clearing. It was Father John. He saw him pause for an instant and then stagger toward them, swaying as if about to fall. The sudden stopping of his breath, the tightening of his arms, drew Nada's shining eyes to his face, and then she too saw the little old missioner as he swayed and staggered across the clearing. With a cry she was out of McKay's arms and running toward him. Father John was leaning heavily upon her when McKay came up. His face was tense and his breath came in choking gasps, but he tried to smile as he clutched a hand at his breast. "I have hurried," he said, making a great effort to speak calmly, "and I am winded." He drew in a deep breath and looked at Jolly Roger. "Roger, I have hurried to tell you. Breault is coming. He cannot be far behind me. Possibly half a mile, or a mile." In the thickening dusk he took Nada's white face between his hands. "I find, at last, that I was mistaken, child," he said very calmly now. "I believe it is not God's will that you remain to be taken by Breault. You must go. There is no time to lose. If Breault does not stumble off the trail in this gloom, he will be here in a few minutes. Come!" Not a word did Nada say as they went to the cabin, and McKay saw her tense face as pale as an ivory cameo in the twilight. But something in the uptilt of her chin and the poise of her head assured him that she was prepared and unafraid. In the cabin the Leaf Bud met them, and to her Nada spoke quickly. There was understanding between them, and Oosimisk dragged in a filled pack from the kitchen while Nada ran into her room and came out with the bundle. Suddenly she was standing before McKay and Father John, her breast throbbing with excitement. "There is nothing more to make ready," she said. "Yellow Bird has been with me all this day, and her spirit told me to prepare. We have everything we need." And then she saw only Father John, and put her arms closely about his neck, and with wide, tearless eyes looked into his face. "Father, you will come to us?" she whispered. "You promise that?" The missioner's arms closed about her, and he bowed his face against her lips and cheek. "I pray God that it may be so," he said. Nada's arms tightened convulsively, and in that moment there came a warning growl from outside the cabin door. "Peter!" she cried. In another moment Father John had extinguished the light. "Go, my children," he commanded. "You must be quick. 20 paces below the pool is a canoe. I had one of my Indians leave it there yesterday, and it is ready. Roger, Nada." He groped out, and the hands of the three met in the darkness. "God bless you both. And go south, always south. Now go, go. I think I hear footsteps." He thrust them to the door, Nada with her bundle and Roger with his pack. Suddenly he felt Peter at his side, and reaching down he fastened his fingers in the scruff of his neck and held him back. "Good-bye," he whispered huskily. "Good-bye, Nada, Roger." A sob came back out of the gloom. "Good-bye, Father." And then they listened, Peter and Father John, until the swift footsteps of the two they loved passed beyond their hearing. Peter whimpered and struggled a little, but Father John held him as he closed the door. "It's best for you to stay, Peter," he tried to explain. "It's best for you to stay with me. For I think they are going a far distance, and will come to a land where you would shrivel up and die. Besides, you could not go in the canoe. So be good and remain with me, Peter, with me." And the Leaf Bud, standing wide-eyed and motionless, heard a strange little choking laugh come from Father John as he groped in darkness for a light. End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 21 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. A slow illumination filled the cabin, first the yellow flare of a match and then the light of a lamp. And as Father John's waxen face grew out of the darkness, Peter whimpered and whined and scratched with his paws at the closed door. Oosimisk, the Leaf Bud, stood like a statue, with her wide, dark eyes staring at Father John, but scarcely seeming to breathe. In the old missioner's face came a trembling smile and a look of triumph as he read the fear-written question in her steady gaze. "All is well, Oosimisk," he said quietly, speaking in Cree. "They are safely away, and will not be caught. Continue with your duties, and let no one see that anything unusual has happened. Breault will come very soon." He straightened his shoulders as if to give himself confidence and strength, and then he called Peter, and comforted the dog whose master and mistress were fleeing through the dark. "They have reached the pool," he said, seating himself and holding Peter's shaggy head between his hands. "They have just about reached the pool, and Breault must be entering the clearing on the other side. Roger cannot miss the canoe, 20 paces down and with nothing to shadow it overhead. I think he has found it by this time, and in another half-minute they will be off. And it is very black down the Burntwood, with deep timber close to the water, and for many miles no man can follow by night along its shores." Suddenly his hands tightened, and the Leaf Bud, watching him slyly, saw the last of suspense go out of his face. "And now they are safe!" he cried exultantly. "They must be on their way, and Breault has not come across the clearing." He rose to his feet and began pacing back and forth, while Peter sniffed yearningly at the door again. Oosimisk, with the caution of her race in moments of danger, was drawing the curtains at the windows, and Father John smiled his approbation. He did not want Breault, the man-hunter, peering through one of the windows at him. Even as he walked back and forth he listened intently for Breault's footsteps. Peter, with a sigh, gave up his scratching and settled himself on his haunches close to Nada's door. Father John, in passing him, paused to lay a hand on his head. "Some day it may please God to let us go to them," he consoled, speaking for himself even more than for Peter. "Some day, when they are far away and safe." He felt Peter suddenly stiffen under his hand, and from the Leaf Bud came a low, swift word of warning. She began singing softly, and dishes and pans already clean rattled under her hands in the kitchen, and she continued to sing even as the cabin door opened and Breault, the man-hunter, stood in it. The unexpectedness of his appearance, without the sound of a warning footstep outside, was amazing, even to Peter. In the open door he stood for a moment, his thin, ferret-like face standing out against the black background of the night, and his strange eyes, apparently half-closed yet bright as diamonds, sweeping the interior without effort but with the quickness of lightning. There was something deadly and foreboding about him as he stood here, and Peter growled low in his throat. Recognition flashed upon him in an instant. It was the man of the snow dune, away up on the Barren, the man whom he had mistrusted from the beginning, and from whom they had fled into the face of the big storm months ago. His mind worked swiftly, even as swiftly as Breault's in its way, and without any process of reasoning he sensed menace and enmity in this man's appearance, and associated with it the mysterious flight of Jolly Roger and Nada. Breault had nodded without speaking. Then his eyes rested on Peter, and his face broke into a twisted sort of smile. It was not altogether unpleasant, yet was there something about it which made one shiver. It spoke the character of the man, pitiless, determined, omniscient almost, as if the spirit of a grim and unrelenting fate walked with him. Again he nodded, and held out a hand. "Peter!" he called. "Come here, Peter!" Peter flattened his ears a fraction of an inch, but did not move. Even that fraction of an inch caught Breault's keen eyes. "Still a one-man dog," he observed, stepping well inside the cabin and facing Father John. "Where is McKay, Father?" He had not closed the door, and Peter saw his chance. The Leaf Bud saw him pass like a shot out into the night, but as he went she made no effort to call him back, for her ears were wide open as Breault repeated his question. "Where is McKay, Father?" Peter heard the man-hunter's voice from the darkness outside. For barely an instant he paused, picking up the fresh scent of Nada and Jolly Roger. It was easy to follow, straight to the pool, and from the pool 20 paces downstream, where a little finger of sand and pebbles had been formed by the eddies. In this bar was fresh imprint of the canoe, and here the footprints ended. Peter whimpered, peering into the tunnel of darkness between forest trees, where the water rippled and gurgled softly on its way into a deeper and more tangled wilderness. He waded belly deep into the current, half determined to swim, and then he waited, listening intently, but could hear no sound of voice or paddle stroke. Yet he knew Jolly Roger and Nada could not be far away. He returned to the edge of the pool and began sniffing his way downstream, pausing every 2 or 3 minutes to listen. Now and then he caught the presence of those he sought in the air, but those intervals in which he stopped to catch sound of voice or paddle lost him time, so the canoe was traveling faster than Peter. Halfway between himself and the bow of that canoe, McKay could dimly make out Nada's pale face in the star-glow that filtered like a mist through the tops of the close-hanging trees. Scarcely above his breath he laughed in joyous confidence. "At last my dream is coming true, Nada," he whispered. "You are mine, and we are going into another world. No one will ever find us there, no one but Father John, when we send him word. You are not afraid?" Her voice trembled a little in the gloom. "No, I am not afraid. But it is dark, so dark." "The moon will be with us again in a few nights, your moon, with the old man smiling down on us. I know how the man in the moon must feel when he's on the other side of the world and can't see you, Nada." Her silence made him lean toward her, striving to get a better view of her face where the starlight broke through an opening in the tree-tops. And in that moment he heard a little breath that was almost a sob. "It's Peter," she said, before he could speak. "Oh, Roger, why didn't we bring Peter?" "Possibly we should have," he replied, skipping a stroke with his paddle. "But I think we have done the best thing for Peter. He is a wilderness dog, and has never known anything different. Over there, where we are going—" "I understand. And some day Father John will bring him?" "Yes, he has promised that. Peter will come to us when Father John comes." She had turned, looking into the pit gloom ahead of them, so dark that the canoe seemed about to drive against a wall. Under its bow the water gurgled like oil. "We are entering the Big Cedar Swamp," he explained. "It's like Blind Man's Bluff, isn't it? Can you see?"
"Not beyond the bow of the canoe, Roger."
"Work back to me," he said, "very carefully." She came obediently. "Now turn slowly, so that you face the bow, and lean back with your head against my knees." This also she did.
"This is much nicer," she whispered, nestling her head comfortably against him. "So much nicer."
By leaning over until his back nearly cracked he was able to find her lips in the darkness. "I was thinking of the brush that overhangs the stream," he explained when he had straightened himself. "Sitting up as you were, it might have caused you hurt." There was a little silence between them, in which his paddle caught again its slow and steady rhythm. Then, "Were you thinking only of the brush, Roger, and of the hurt it might cause me?" "Yes, only of that." And he chuckled softly.
"Then I don't think it's nice here at all," she complained. "I shall sit up straight so the brush may put my eyes out."
But her head pressed even closer against him, and careful not to interrupt his paddle stroke, she touched his face for an instant with her hand.
"It's there," she purled, as if utterly comforted. "I wanted to be sure. It's so dark."
With Cimmerian blackness on all sides of them, and a chaotic tunnel ahead, they were happy. Staring straight before him, though utterly unable to see, McKay sensed in every movement he made and in every breath he drew the exquisite thrill of a miracle. And the same thrill swept into him and through him from the softly breathing body of Nada. Light or darkness made no difference now. Together, inseparable from this time forth, they had started on the one great adventure of their lives, and for them fear had ceased to exist. The night sheltered them. Its very blackness held in its embrace a warmth of welcome and of unending hope. Twice in the next half hour he put his hand to Nada's face, and each time she pressed her lips against it, sweet with that confidence which so completely possessed her soul. Very slowly they moved through the swamp, for because of the gloom his paddle strokes were exceedingly short, and he was feeling his way. Frequently he ran into brush, or struck the boggy shore, and occasionally Nada would hold lighted matches while he extricated the canoe from tree-tops and driftwood that impeded the way. He loved the brief glimpses he caught of her face in the match-glow, and twice he deliberately wasted the tiny flares that he might hold the vision of her a little longer. At last he began to feel the pulse of a current against his paddle, and soon after that the star-mist began filtering through the thinning tree-tops again, so that he knew they were almost through the swamp. Another half hour and they were free of it, with a clear sky overhead and the cheering song of running water on both sides of them. Nada sat up, and it was now so light that he could see the soft shimmer of her hair in the starlight. He also saw a pretty little grimace in her face, even as she smiled at him.
I can't move," she exclaimed. "Ugh, my feet are asleep."
"We'll go ashore and stretch ourselves," said McKay, who had looked at his watch in the light of the last match. "We've 2 hours the start of Breault, and there's no other canoe." He began watching the shore closely, and it was not long before he made out the white smoothness of a sandbar on their right. Here they landed and for half an hour rested their cramped limbs. Then they went on, and in his heart McKay blessed the deep swamp that lay between them and Breault. "I don't think he can make it without a canoe, even if he guesses we went this way," he explained to Nada. "And that means we are safe." There was a cheery ring in his voice which would have changed to the deadness of cold iron could he have looked back into that sluggish pit of the burntwood through which they had come, or could he have seen into the heart of the still blacker swamp. For through the swamp, feeling his way in the black abysses and amid the monster ghosts of darkness, came Peter. And down the Burntwood, between the boggy mucklips of the swamp, a man followed with slow but deadly surety, guiding with a long pole 2 light cedar timbers which he had lashed together with wire, and which bore him safely and in triumph where the canoe had gone before him. This man was Breault, the man-hunter. "The swamp will hold him," McKay was saying again, exultantly. "Even if he guesses our way, the swamp will hold him back, Nada." "But he won't know the way we have come," cried Nada, the faith in her voice answering his own. "Father John will guide him in another direction." Back in the pit gloom, with a grim smile now and then relaxing the tight-set compression of his thin lips, and with eyes that stared like a night owl's into the gloom ahead of him, Breault poled steadily on. End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 22 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. Dripping from the bog holes and lathered with mud, it was the mystery of Breault's noiseless presence somewhere near him in the still night that drew Peter continually deeper into the swamp. Half a dozen times he caught the scent of him in a quiet air that seemed only now and then to rise up in his face softly, as if stirred by butterflies' wings. Always it came from ahead, and Peter's mind worked swiftly to the decision that where Breault was, there also would be Nada and Jolly Roger. Yet he caught the scent of neither of these two, and that puzzled him. Many times he found himself at the edge of the black lip of water, but never quite at the right time to see a shadow in its darkness, or hear the sound of Breault's pole. But in the swamp, as he went on, he saw nothing but shadow, and heard weird and nameless sounds which made his blood creep, even though his courage was now full grown within him. He was not frightened at the ugly sputter of the owls, as in the days of old. Their throaty menace and snapping beaks did not stop him nor turn him aside. The slashing scrape of claws in the bark of trees and the occasional crackling of brush were matters of intimate knowledge, and he gave but little attention to them in his eagerness to reach those who had gone ahead of him. What troubled him, and filled his eyes with sudden red glares, were the oily gurgles of the pitfalls which tried to suck him down, the laughing madness of muck that held him as if living things were in it, and which spluttered and coughed when he freed himself. Half blinded at times, so that even the black shadows were blotted out, he went on. And at last, coming again to the edge of the stream, he heard a new kind of sound, the slow, steady dipping of Breault's pole. He hurried on, finding harder ground under his feet, and came noiselessly abreast of the man on his raft of cedar timbers. He could almost hear his breathing. And very faintly he could see in the vast gloom a shadow that moved slowly against the background of a still deeper shadow beyond. But there was no scent of Nada or Jolly Roger, and whatever desire had risen in him to make himself known was smothered by caution and suspicion. After this he did not go ahead of Breault, but kept behind him or abreast of him, within sound of the dipping pole. And every minute his heart thumped expectantly, and he sniffed the new air for signs of those he most desired to find. Dawn was breaking in the sky when they came out of the swamp, and the first flush of the sun was lighting up the east, when Breault headed his improvised craft for the sandbar upon which Nada and McKay had rested many hours before. Breault was tired, but his eyes lighted up when he saw the footprints in the sand, and he chuckled, almost good-humoredly. As a matter of fact, he was in a good humor. but one would not have reckoned it as such in Breault. A hard man, the forests called him, a man with the hunting instincts of the fox and the wolf and the merciless persistency of the weasel, a man who lived his code to the last letter of the law, without pity and without favoritism. At least, so he was judged, and his hard, narrow eyes, his thin lips and his cynically lined face seldom betrayed the better thoughts within him, if he possessed any at all. In the service he was regarded as a humanly perfect mechanism, a bit of machinery that never failed, the dreaded nemesis to be set on the trail of a wrongdoer when all others had failed. But this morning, with every bone and muscle in him aching from his long night of tedious exertion, the chuckle grew into a laugh as he looked upon the telltale signs in the sand. He stretched himself and his tired bones cracked. Breault did not think aloud, but he was saying to himself, "There, against that rock, Jolly Roger McKay sat. There is the imprint of only one person sitting. The girl was in his arms. Here are little holes where her outstretched heels rested in the sand. She is wearing shoes and not moccasins." He grinned as he drew his service pack from the two-log cedar raft. "Plenty of time now," he continued to think. "They are mine this time, sure. They believe they have fooled me, and they haven't. That's fatal, always." Not infrequently, when entirely alone, Breault let a little part of himself loose, as if freeing a prisoner from bondage for a short time. For instance, he whistled. It was not an unpleasant whistle, but rather oddly reminiscent of tender things he remembered away back somewhere, and as he fried his bacon and steamed a handful of desiccated potatoes, he hummed a song, also rather pleasant to ears that were as closely attentive as Peter's. For Peter had crept up through a tangle of ground scrub and lay not 20 paces away, smelling of the bacon hungrily and watching intently from his concealment. Peter knew the fox and the wolf, but he did not know Breault, and he did not guess why the man's whistling grew a little louder, nor why his humming voice grew stronger. But after a time, with his back and not his face toward Peter, Breault called in the most natural and matter-of-fact voice in the world, "Come on, Peter. Breakfast is ready." Peter's jaws dropped in amazement, and as Breault turned toward him, his thin face a grin, and continued to invite him in a most companionable way, he forgot his concealment entirely and stood up straight, ready either to fight or fly. Breault tossed him a dripping slice of bacon which he held in his hand. It fell within a foot of Peter's nose, and Peter was ravenously hungry. The delicious odor of it demoralized his senses and his caution. For a few seconds he resisted, then thrust himself out toward it an inch at a time, made a sudden grab, and swallowed it at one gulp. Breault laughed outright, and with the first of the sun striking into his face, he did not look like an enemy to Peter. A second slice of bacon followed the first, and then a third, until Breault was frying another mess over the fire. "That's partial payment for what you did up on the Barren," he was saying inside himself. "If it hadn't been for you—" He didn't even imagine the rest. Nor after that did he pay the slightest attention to Peter. For Breault knew dogs possibly even better than he knew men, and not by the smallest sign did he give Peter to understand that he was interested in him at all. He washed his dishes, whistling and humming, reloaded his pack on the raft, and once more began poling his way downstream. Peter, still in the edge of the scrub, was not only puzzled, but felt a further sense of abandonment. After all, this man was not his enemy, and he was leaving him as his master and mistress had left him. He whined, and Breault was not out of sight when he trotted down to the sandbar and quickly found the scent of Nada and McKay. Purposely, Breault had left a lump of desiccated potato as big as his fist, and this Peter ate as ravenously as he had eaten the bacon. Then, just as Breault knew he would do, he began following the raft. Breault did not hurry, and he did not rest. There was something almost mechanically certain in his slow but steady progress, though he knew it was possible for the canoe to outdistance him 3-1. He was missing nothing along the shore. 3 times during the forenoon he saw where the canoe had landed, and he chuckled each time, thinking of the old story of the tortoise and the hare. He stopped for not more than 2 or 3 minutes at each of these places, and was then on his way again. Peter was fascinated by the unexcited persistency of the man's movement. He followed it, watched it, and became more and more interested in the unvarying monotony of it. There were the same up and down strokes of the long pole, the slight swaying of the upstanding body, the same eddy behind the cedar logs, and occasionally wisps of smoke floating behind when the pursuer smoked his pipe. Not once did Peter see Breault turn his head to look behind him. Yet Breault was seeing everything. 5 times that morning he saw Peter, but not once did he make a sign or call to him. He drove his raft ashore at 12 o'clock to prepare his dinner, and after he had built a fire, and his cooking things were scattered about, he straightened himself up and called in that same matter-of-fact way, as if expecting an immediate response. "Here, Peter! Peter, come in, boy!" And Peter came. Fighting against the last instinct that held him back, he first thrust his head out from the brush and looked at Breault. Breault paid no attention to him for a few moments, but sliced his bacon. When the perfume of the cooking meat reached Peter's nose, he edged himself a little nearer, and with a whimpering sigh flattened himself on his belly. Breault heard the sigh and grunted a reply. "Hungry again, Peter?" he inquired casually. He had saved for this moment a piece of cooked bacon held over from breakfast, and tearing this with his finger, he tossed the strips to Peter. As he did this, he was thinking to himself, "Why am I doing this? I don't want the dog. He'll be a nuisance. He'll eat my grub. But it's fair. I'm paying a debt. He helped to save me up on the Barren." Thus did Breault, the man without mercy, the Nemesis, briefly analyze the matter. And he cooked 5 pieces of bacon for Peter. During the rest of that day, Peter made no effort to keep himself in concealment as he followed Breault and his raft. This afternoon Breault shot a fawn, and when he made camp that night both he and Peter feasted on fresh meat. This broke down the last of Peter's suspicion, and Breault laid a hand on his head. He did not particularly like the feel of the hand, but he tolerated it, and Breault grunted aloud, with a note of condemnation in his hard voice. "A one-man dog, never anything else." Half a dozen times during the day Peter had found the scent of Nada and Roger where they had come ashore, and from this night on he associated Breault as a necessary agent in his search for them. And with Breault he went, instinctively guessing the truth. The next day they found where Nada and McKay had abandoned the canoe and had struck south through the wilderness. This pleased Breault, who was tired of his poling. This 3rd night there was a new moon, and something about it stirred in Peter an impulse to run ahead and overtake those he was seeking. But a still strong instinct held him to Breault. Tonight Breault slept like a dead man on his cedar boughs. He was up and had a fire built an hour before dawn, and with the first gray streaking of day was on the trail again. He made no further effort to follow signs of the pursued, for that was a hopeless task. But he knew how McKay was heading, and he traveled swiftly, figuring to cover twice the distance that Nada might travel in the same given time. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he came to a great ridge, and on its highest pinnacle he stopped. Peter had grown restless again, and a little more suspicious of Breault. He was not afraid of him, but all that day he had found no scent of Nada or Jolly Roger, and slowly the conviction was impinging itself upon him that he should seek for himself in the wilderness. Breault saw this restlessness, and understood it. "I'll keep my eye on the dog," he thought. "He has a nose and an uncanny sixth sense, and I haven't either. He will bear watching. I believe McKay and the girl cannot be far away. Possibly they have traveled more slowly than I thought, and haven't passed this ridge. Or it may be they are down there, in the plain. If so, I should catch sign of smoke or fire in time." For an hour he kept watch over the plain through his binoculars, seeking for a wisp of smoke that might rise at any time over the tree-tops. He did not lose sight of Peter, questing out in widening circles below him. And then, quite unexpectedly, something happened. In the edge of a tiny meadow, an eighth of a mile away, Peter was acting strangely. He was nosing the ground, gulping the wind, twisting eagerly back and forth. Then he set out, steadily and with unmistakable decision, south and west. In a flash Breault was on his feet, had caught up his pack, and was running for the meadow. And there he found something in the velvety softness of the earth which brought a grim smile to his thin lips, as he, too, set out south and west. The scent he had found, hours old, drew Peter on until, in the edge of the dusk of evening, it brought him to a foot-worn trail leading to the Hudson's Bay Company post many miles south. In this path, beaten by the feet of generations of forest dwellers, the hard heels of McKay's boots had made their imprint, and after this the scent was clearer under Peter's nose. But with forest-bred caution he still traveled slowly, though his blood was burning like a pitch-fed fire in his veins. Almost as swiftly followed Breault behind him. Again came darkness, and then the moon, brighter than last night, lighting his way between the two walls of the forest. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 23 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. Dawn came softly where the quiet waters of the Willow Bud ran under deep forests of evergreen out into the gold and silver birch of the Nelson River flats. A veiling mist rose out of the earth to meet the promise of day, gentle and sweet, like scented raiment, stirring sleepily to the pulse of an awakening earth. Through it came the first low twitter of bird-song, a sound that seemed to swell and grow until it filled the world. Yet was it still a sound of sleep, of half-wakefulness, and the mist was thinning away when a ruffled little breast sent out its full-throat song from the tip of a silver birch that overhung the stream. The little warbler was looking down, as if wondering why there was no stir of life beneath him, where in last night's sunset there had been much to wonder at, and a new kind of song to thrill him. But the girl was no longer there to sing back at him. The cedar and balsam shelter dripped with morning dew, the place where fire had been was black and dead, and ruffling his feathers the warbler continued his song in triumph. Nada, hidden under her shelter, and still half dreaming, heard him. She lay with her head nestled in the crook of Roger's arm, and the bird-song seemed to come to her from a great distance away. She smiled, and her lips trembled as if even in sleep she was about to answer it. And then the song drifted away until she could no longer hear it,
and she sank back into an oblivion of darkness in which she seemed lost for a long time, and out of which some invisible force was struggling to drag her. There came at last a sudden irresistible pull at her senses, and she opened her eyes, awake. Her head was no longer in the crook of Jolly Roger's arm. She could see him sitting up straight, and he was not looking at her. It must be late, she thought, for the light was strong in his face, warm with the first golden flow of the sun. She smiled and sat up, and shook her soft curls with a happy little laugh. "Roger!" And then she, too, was staring, wide-eyed and speechless. For she saw Peter under Jolly Roger's hand. But it was not Peter who drew her breath short and sent fear cutting like a sharp knife through her heart. Facing them, seated coldly on a log which McKay had dragged in from the timber, was a thin-faced, sharp-eyed man who was studying them with an odd smile on his lips, and instantly Nada knew this man was Breault. There was something peculiarly appalling about him as he sat there, in spite of the fact that for a few moments he neither spoke nor moved. His eyes, Nada thought, were not like human eyes, and his lips were like the blades of two knives set together. Yet he was smiling, or half-smiling, not in a comforting or humorous way, but with exultation and triumph. From looking at him, one would never have guessed that Breault loved his joke. He nodded. "Good morning, Jolly Roger McKay. And good morning, Mrs. Jolly Roger McKay. Pardon me for watching you like this, but duty is duty. I am Breault, of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police." McKay wet his lips. Breault saw him, and the grin on his thin face widened. "I know, it's hard," he said, "but you've got Peter to thank for it. Peter led me to you." He stood up, and in a most casual fashion covered Jolly Roger with his automatic. "Would you mind stepping out, McKay?" he asked. In his other hand he dangled a pair of handcuffs. McKay stood up, and Nada rose beside him, gripping his arms with both hands. "No need of those things, Breault," he said. "I'll go peaceably." "Still, it's safer," argued Breault, a wicked glitter in his eyes. "Hold out one hand, please." The manacles snapped over Jolly Roger's wrist. "I'm Breault, not Terence Cassidy," he chuckled. "Never take a chance, you know. Never." Swift as a flash was his movement then, as the companion bracelet snapped over Nada's wrist. He stepped back, facing them with a grin. "Got you both now, haven't I?" he gloated. "Can't get away, can you?" He put his gun away, and bowed low to Nada. "How do you like married life, Mrs. Jolly Roger?" McKay's face was whiter than Nada's. "You coward!" he spoke in a low, quiet voice. "You low-down, miserable coward! You're a disgrace to the service. Do you mean you're going to keep my wife ironed like this?" "Sure," said Breault. "I'm going to make you pay for some of the trouble I've had over you. I believe in a man paying his debts, you know. And a woman, too. And probably you've lied to her like the very devil." "He hasn't," protested Nada fiercely. "You're a—" "Say it," nodded Breault good-humoredly. "By all means, say it, Mrs. Jolly Roger. If you can't find words, let me help you." And while he waited, he loaded his pipe and lighted it. "You see, I don't exactly live up to regulations when I'm with good friends like you," he apologized cynically. "In other words, you're a couple of hard cases. Cassidy has turned in all sorts of evidence about you. He says that you, McKay, should be hung the moment we catch you. He warned me not to take a chance, that you'd slit my throat in the dark without a prick of conscience. And I'm a valuable man in the service. It can't afford to lose me."
McKay shut his lips tightly and did not answer.
"Now, while you're helpless, I want to tell you a few things," Breault went on. "And while I'm talking, I'll start the fire so we can have breakfast. Peter and I are hungry. A good dog, McKay. He saved us up on the Barren. Have you told Mrs. Jolly Roger about that?"
He expected no answer, and whistled as he lighted a pile of birch bark which he had already placed under dry cedar wood which McKay had gathered the preceding evening.
"That's where my trouble began, up there on the Barren, Mrs. Jolly Roger," he continued, ignoring McKay. "You see, the three of us, Superintendent Tavish and Porter, who is now his son-in-law, and I, had a splendid chance to die like martyrs, and go down forever in the history of the service, if it hadn't been for this fool of a husband of yours, and Peter. I can't blame Peter, because he's only a dog. But McKay is responsible. He robbed us of a beautiful opportunity of dying in an unusual way, by hunting us up and dragging us into his shelter. A shabby trick, don't you think? And inasmuch as Superintendent Tavish is about the biggest man in the service, and Porter is his son-in-law, and Miss Tavish was saved along with us, why, they reckoned something ought to be done about it."
Breault did not look up. With exasperating slowness he added fuel to the fire.
"And so," he rose and stood before them again, "and so they assigned me to the very unpleasant duty of running you down with a pardon, McKay. A pardon forgiving you for all your sins, forever and ever. Amen. And here it is."
He had drawn an official-looking envelope from inside his coat and held it out now, not to McKay, but to Nada. Neither reached for it. Standing there with the cynical smile still on his lips, his strange eyes gimleting them with a cold sort of laughter, it was as if Breault tortured them with a last horrible joke. Then, suddenly, Nada seized the envelope and tore it open, while McKay stared at Breault, believing and yet not daring to speak. It was Nada's cry, a cry wild and sobbing and filled with gladness, that told him the truth, and with the precious paper clutched in her hand she smothered her face against McKay's breast, while Breault came up grinning behind them, and Jolly Roger heard the click of his key in the handcuffs. "I am also loaded with a number of foolish messages for you," he said, attending to the fire again. "For instance, that red-headed good-for-nothing Cassidy says to tell you he's building a 4-room bungalow for you in their clearing, and that it'll be finished by the time you arrive. Also, a squaw named Yellow Bird, and a redskin who calls himself Slim Buck, sent word that you will always be welcome in their hunting grounds. And a pretty little thing named Sun Cloud sent as many kisses as there are leaves on the trees." He paused, chuckling, and did not look up to see the wide, glorious eyes of the girl upon him. "But the funniest thing of all is the baby," he went on, preparing to slice bacon. "They're going to have one pretty soon, Cassidy's wife, I mean. They've given it a name already. If it's a boy, it's Roger. If it's a girl, it's Nada. They wanted me to tell you that. Silly bunch, aren't they? A couple of young fools." Just then something new happened in the weirdly adventurous life of François Breault. Without warning he was suddenly smothered in a pair of arms, his head was jerked back, and against his hard and pitiless mouth a pair of soft red lips pressed for a single thrilling instant. "Well, I'll be damned!" he gasped, dropping his bacon and staggering to his feet like a man who had been shot. "I'll be cussed!" And he picked up his pack and walked off into the thick young spruce at the edge of the timber, without saying another word or once looking behind him. And breakfast waited, and Nada and Jolly Roger and Peter waited, but François Breault did not return. for a strange and unaccountable man was he, a hard and pitiless man and a deadly hunter who knew no fear. Yet the wilderness swallowed him, a coward at last, running away from the two red lips that had kissed him. So went Breault, for the first time in his life a messenger of mercy, and at the top of the silver birch the little warbler knew that something glad had happened, and offered up its gratitude in a sudden burst of song. The End. End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Moline. End of The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood.